long before Moses ever climbed a mountain in Sinai, before any stone tablets, before the very idea of the Ten Commandments existed. Ancient Egyptians were already whispering something eerily familiar into the darkness of their tombs. Thousands of years earlier, they were reciting 42 declarations. Statements like, "I have not killed, I have not stolen, I have not told lies, I have not committed adultery." Sound familiar? These weren't laws carved into stone and handed down from a burning bush. They were something stranger, something older. They were confessions spoken to the gods themselves, a spiritual checklist recited by the dead as they stood before judgment, hoping to prove their heart was pure enough to enter the afterlife. Scholars call them the negative confessions, part of spell 125 in what we now know as the Egyptian Book of the Dead. And once you start reading through all 42 of them, you start noticing something unsettling. The moral architecture feels startlingly close to commandments. Most of us grew up learning. But here's the question nobody has a clean answer for. Is this a case of one civilization directly influencing another? Or did two separate cultures, thousands of miles and centuries apart, somehow arrive at the same idea of right and wrong, completely on their own? That mystery is exactly what we're diving into today. Before we get into it, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right there where you are. I love seeing this list turn into a map of the world. Tokyo at midnight, London at lunch, someone in Brazil just waking up. It's wild. And if you enjoy going down historical rabbit holes like this one, the best way to support what we do here is by following the show on Spotify. Listen there, and if you're enjoying it, leave us a 5-star review. The link is right in the description. It genuinely helps more than you'd think. Also, if you love mysteries humanity still hasn't fully solved, we wrote an entire book covering 12 of the most unexplained ones in history. You'll find the link to grab it on our website, also in the description. Now, let's step into the world of ancient Egypt and uncover all 42 confessions one by one. 1. The Negative Confessions of Spell, 125. Picture this. You're standing in the Hall of Two Truths, an enormous chamber lit by torches that never seem to flicker, walls stretching so high you can't see where they end. 42 divine judges line the room, one for each province of Egypt, and every single one of them is staring directly at your soul. In front of you sits Osiris, Lord of the Dead, flanked by Anubis and Thoth. To your left, a golden scale. On one side rests your heart. On the other, a single feather, the symbol of Murat, the goddess of truth, balance, and cosmic order. And crouched beside the scale, waiting, is Amit, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, ready to devour your heart on the spot if it tips the wrong way. This is the scene ancient Egyptians believed awaited them after death. And before that scale could even be trusted, you had to speak. You had to stand there and recite 42 declarations, one to each of those divine judges, insisting that you had lived a righteous life. This is spell 125, arguably the most famous section of the entire Egyptian Book of the Dead, and it's where all 42 of these so-called laws actually come from. But here's the thing, scholars want you to understand clearly. This wasn't legislation. There was no Egyptian court system handing out punishments based on this list. Nobody was arrested for violating confession number 17. This was liturgy, not law. It was a spiritual script, memorized, inscribed, painted onto coffins and papyrus scrolls, meant to be spoken in the afterlife, not enforced in daily Egyptian society. Think of it less like a legal code and more like a cosmic job interview, where the only way to pass was to convince 42 gods, one after another, that you deserved eternity. And yet, despite that crucial distinction, the moral content packed into these declarations is staggering. Murder, theft, lying, adultery, cheating the poor, cursing the king, polluting water, mistreating animals. It reads like someone in ancient Egypt had already worked out an entire ethical framework for human behaviour, thousands of years before anything resembling the Ten Commandments existed. That's exactly why this list keeps resurfacing in modern conversations about the origins of morality itself. Not because it's proof of theft or copying, but because it forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. Did these ideas spread from Egypt outward, seeding later moral traditions across the ancient world? Or does the human conscience simply arrive at the same conclusions again and again, independent of geography, independent of century, independent of religion? We don't know yet, but we're about to go through every single one of these 42 declarations, and I think you're going to start forming your own theory long before we reach the end. 2. I have not committed sin. The very first declaration doesn't ease you in gently. It doesn't start small, it opens with the broadest possible claim a person could make standing before the gods. I have not committed sin. Not, I have not committed this specific sin or that particular offence, but a sweeping, all-encompassing denial of wrongdoing entirely. Imagine the audacity required to say that out loud, knowing full well that Amit is crouched right there, waiting, hungry, ready to swallow your heart the instant the scale tips even slightly against you. This opening line functions almost like a thesis statement for everything that follows. The soul is essentially saying, before we get into specifics, understand this. My entire life was lived in alignment with Mat, with truth, balance, and order. Egyptologists believe this general declaration mattered because Egyptian religious thought didn't separate sin into neat categories, the way many later traditions would. Wrongdoing wasn't just about breaking individual rules. It was about disrupting Ma'at itself, the fundamental order holding the universe together. Every lie, every theft, every act of cruelty was seen as a crack in that cosmic structure. So, before diving into the specifics, the deceased had to first claim they had preserved that order as a whole. Of course, this raises an obvious question. If the very first line requires you to claim complete innocence, was anyone actually expected to be perfect? Almost certainly not. Egyptologists think this recitation worked more like a magical spell than a truthful courtroom testimony. A ritual formula spoken with confidence, meant to align the soul with truth through the act of speaking it. Confidence, it seems, was half the battle in the afterlife. And this is just the opening line. What comes next gets far more specific, and far more revealing about what ancient Egyptians actually feared, valued, and considered sacred. 3. I have not robbed with violence. Now the declarations narrow their focus. Not every wrong was treated as the same kind of wrong. The ancient Egyptians understood something we still understand instinctively today. Taking something from another person is bad, but taking it through force, terror, or physical violence is something worse. I have not robbed with violence, that is the declaration. Short, direct, and terrifyingly specific. Standing before the judges of the dead, the soul had to deny that it had seized another person's property by force. Not merely taken it, not merely found it and failed to return it. Robbed it violently. Think about what that means in an ancient Egyptian setting. Egypt was a civilization built along a narrow ribbon of fertile land, surrounded by desert. Most people lived close together, dependent on the Nile, dependent on harvests, dependent on cooperation. A farmer's grain stores could mean the difference between survival and starvation. A merchant's goods represented months of travel and risk. A labourer's tools were not conveniences, they were his livelihood. To take those things by violence wasn't just a private crime against one victim. It threatened the fragile trust that kept an entire community alive. And that brings us back to Ma'at. In Egyptian thought, Ma'at was not simply being nice. It was the proper order of the universe. The rising of the sun, the flooding of the Nile, honest weights in the marketplace. A judge making a fair decision, a powerful man not crushing a weaker one just because he could. Violence, especially violence used to steal, was the opposite of that order. It was chaos forcing its way into the human world. The Egyptians even had a name for chaos. Isfet, disorder. Falsehood, cruelty. The breakdown of everything that should be stable. When someone robbed another person with violence, they weren't merely gaining property. They were choosing Isfet over Ma'at, and in the Hall of Two Truths, that choice could become fatal. Picture a man who spent his life intimidating his neighbours. Maybe he had strength, connections, a weapon, or simply a reputation that made others afraid to resist him. In life, he might have gotten away with it. No police force catches every criminal. No village can always stand against the local bully. But after death, there was no escaping into the desert, no bribing an official, no threatening a witness. Your own heart was the witness. Your own heart was placed on the scale. And if that heart carried the weight of violence, Amit was waiting. What makes this declaration so interesting is that it shows the negative confessions were not just concerned with grand religious offences. They reached into the raw mechanics of daily life. Who had power? Who abused it? Who took what belonged to someone else because they could? Now, we should be careful here. This is not evidence that Egypt had invented a modern theory of criminal law, and it definitely does not prove that later biblical commandments were copied from this text. Similar moral ideas appear in many ancient cultures for a very simple reason. Human beings living together eventually discover that violence makes everyone less safe. But spell 125 reveals that, for ancient Egyptians, robbery with violence was not only a social danger, it was a spiritual danger. You could carry stolen goods away from a victim. You could escape punishment for years, but according to this ritual, you could not carry that violence past the gods. And then comes the next declaration, because apparently you didn't need a weapon in your hand to put your soul in danger. For I have not stolen, I have not stolen. At first, that might sound like the same confession we just heard. If robbery with violence is forbidden, isn't theft already covered? Why make a separate declaration? Why stand before another divine judge and deny it all over again? Because to the ancient Egyptian mind, the difference mattered. Robbery with violence was about force, fear, the powerful taking from the vulnerable. But ordinary theft was something else. It could happen quietly. A hand slipping into a basket, grain disappearing from a storehouse. A servant taking oil from a household jar. A merchant adjusting the count when nobody was looking. No blood, no threats, no weapon. Just one person deciding that another person's property was available for the taking. And that decision still disturbed Ma'at. This is where the negative confessions become surprisingly sharp. They don't only condemn dramatic evil, the kind that makes everybody stop and stare. They also go after the hidden things, the private betrayals, the small dishonesties that might never be discovered by anyone else. Because imagine how much trust a civilization needs to function. Egypt's economy depended on fields, workshops, temples, storage facilities, boats moving goods along the Nile, and officials recording what came in and what went out. Grain was collected, measured, redistributed, and stored against famine. Labour was organised, taxes were gathered in kind. If everyone took a little from the common supply, changed a number, pocketed a tool, or stole from a neighbour, the whole system began to leak. Not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly. It's like a great irrigation canal. One small hole in the bank doesn't look catastrophic, But leave it long enough, let more water pour through, and eventually the field beyond it dries out. Theft worked the same way. One act might enrich the thief, but repeated across a community, it damaged the trust that allowed people to survive. That is probably why the text distinguishes theft from violent robbery. Different act, different harm, same cosmic consequence. And here's something worth remembering as we move through these 42 declarations. The wording varies between translations and surviving versions of the Book of the Dead. Ancient Egyptian texts were copied by different scribes across many centuries, so no single English list captures every nuance perfectly. But the central point remains clear. The deceased had to declare innocence not just from spectacular crimes, but from ordinary dishonesty. That should make us pause. Thousands of years before Moses is traditionally imagined receiving commandments at Sinai, Egyptian funerary texts were already placing theft among the acts a soul needed to deny before entering the next world. Is that proof of direct borrowing? No. History is never that easy. Egypt and ancient Israel existed in a wider Near Eastern world where trade, migration, empire, conquest, and storytelling moved ideas in every direction. And some moral rules may simply emerge wherever people have to live beside one another without tearing society apart. Still, the parallel is impossible to miss, and if ancient mysteries like this are exactly your thing, the channel's book on the 12 unexplained mysteries is available through the website link in the description. Because the more you look into the ancient world, the more you realize how many questions are still waiting beneath the surface. But theft wasn't the only way a person could exploit another human being. The next declarations move beyond property into something even more personal. The damage we do with our words, our desires, and the secrets we think nobody else can see. 5. I have not slain men or women, but before the declarations turn toward the quieter forms of damage people can do to one another, they confront the most final act of all. I have not slain men or women. There it is, no loophole. No ambiguity, no distinction between the powerful and the powerless, the rich and the poor, the familiar and the stranger. The soul standing in the Hall of Two Truths had to declare that it had not taken human life. And that matters because ancient Egypt was not some peaceful fantasy world beside the Nile. It was a civilization that knew violence very well. Egypt had armies. It fought wars, it faced invasions, rebellions, palace intrigues, border conflicts and raids. Tomb paintings celebrate military victories. Kings had enemies crushed beneath their chariots. The state could impose harsh punishments. Death was not unknown. It was woven into the reality of the ancient world, just as it was everywhere else. But this declaration shows something important. Even in a world where violence could be glorified when carried out by kings and armies, killing another human being was not treated as morally insignificant. The wording is especially striking because it does not say, I have not been defeated in battle, or I have not killed without permission. It places the burden on the individual soul. What have you done? What blood is on your hands? When your heart is weighed against the feather of mat, can you truthfully say that you did not destroy another person's life? That is a terrifying question, because death ends the possibility of repair. Stolen property can sometimes be returned. A lie can be confessed. An insult can be forgiven. But a person who has been killed cannot simply be restored by an apology. And in Egyptian thought, that made unlawful killing more than a crime against one victim. It was an assault on Ma'at itself. Every person had a place in the ordered world. Farmers planted fields. Boatmen moved goods along the river. Scribes kept records. Parents raised children. Priests performed rituals. Labourers built, repaired, harvested and carried. To kill someone was to tear a hole in that human order. Think about a village along the Nile. One man murdered over a debt, a land dispute, jealousy, anger, or revenge. The victim is gone, but the consequences do not stop there. A family loses a provider, children lose protection. Fields may go unworked. Old parents lose support. Neighbours become afraid. Relatives demand vengeance. One act can spread outward like a crack in a mud brick wall after the floodwaters rise. That is why this declaration has such force. It recognizes that murder is never just one moment. It becomes an absence that keeps expanding. Now, we should be historically careful. Spell 125 is not a modern legal code. The negative confessions are ritual declarations of innocence made by the dead, and their exact wording can vary across manuscripts and translations. They do not give us a neat Egyptian equivalent of a courtroom statute book, and they do not prove that Moses or later Israelite tradition simply borrowed a commandment from Egypt. But the parallel remains powerful. Long before the biblical laws were written down in the form we know, Egyptian funerary texts were already imagining a dead person standing before divine judgment and denying that they had killed another human being. Maybe that should not surprise us. Wherever human beings build communities, they eventually face the same brutal truth. If people can kill one another without consequence, trust collapses. Families live in fear. The strong prey on the weak. Society becomes isfet, chaos, cruelty, and disorder. The Egyptians believed that death did not erase responsibility for that chaos. In fact, death brought responsibility into perfect focus. No witness could be intimidated. No official could be bribed. No body could be hidden forever. The heart knew, and after confronting the taking of life, the text turns to something that may sound far less dramatic. No sword, no blood, no body in the dust, just grain. But in ancient Egypt, grain was never just grain. 6. I have not stolen grain, I have not stolen grain. To modern ears that might sound oddly specific. Grain? Out of all the things a person could steal, why would this one deserve its own declaration before the gods? Because in Egypt, grain was food, grain was wealth, grain was wages, grain was tax revenue, grain was survival stored against the future. The Nile gave Egypt its extraordinary fertility, but that fertility was never automatic. The river flooded, the fields were planted, the crops were harvested, and then enormous quantities of grain had to be measured, moved, recorded, guarded, and stored. If the harvest was good, grain fed people through the year. If the harvest failed, grain stored from earlier seasons could mean the difference between life and famine. So imagine stealing grain from a granary. You are not taking some abstract object. You may be taking bread from a household. You may be taking seed needed for the next planting. You may be taking rations meant for workers. You may be taking taxes collected to support temples, officials, labour crews, and the machinery of the state. A handful might seem small, a sack might seem manageable. But multiply that theft across hundreds of people, across multiple storehouses, across years of poor harvests, and suddenly it becomes a disaster. This is the ancient Egyptian version of a truth we still understand. Some things are so essential that stealing them harms far more than the immediate owner. Steal a luxury item and someone loses property. Steal food from a community reserve during a crisis and you threaten everyone dependent on it. That is why grain was so serious. Egyptian scribes were obsessed with counting it. They measured fields, recorded harvest, tracked deliveries, calculated dues, and watched storehouses. Grain was often used in place of money. Workers could be paid in grain rations. Taxes could be collected in grain. Land productivity could be estimated by grain yield. A corrupt official who skimmed from the storehouse was not just dishonest, he was tampering with the system that kept people alive. And that brings us back to Ma'at. Ma'at required balance, proper measure, honest accounting, the right amount going where it was supposed to go. When grain vanished into someone's private stash, balance was broken. A record no longer matched reality. A labourer's ration became smaller. A widow's food might disappear. A village might discover too late that its reserves were not enough. The thief may have told himself nobody would notice. Maybe he altered a count on a tablet. Maybe he took grain after dark. Maybe he was responsible for weighing sacks and simply made a few sacks lighter before they reached their destination. Small thefts are often built on that same dangerous idea. This is too little to matter. But the Egyptians understood that it mattered. A civilization concentrated along one river depended on systems of storage and redistribution with almost frightening precision. A bad flood, a weak harvest, pests, drought in a neighbouring region, political disorder, any of these could put pressure on the food supply. Grain theft did not merely violate property, it violated the shared security of the whole community. So, in the Hall of Two Truths, the dead person had to say it plainly. I have not stolen grain, not, I only took what I needed, not, everyone else was doing it, not, the storehouse had plenty. Just a declaration before the divine judges that the person had not fed themselves by making others more vulnerable. And once again, we should resist the easy conclusion. This is not proof that the Ten Commandments came directly from Egypt, or that the negative confessions were a hidden earlier version of Sinai. The history is more complicated than that. These are Egyptian declarations of innocence, preserved in funerary texts across centuries. They belong to their own religious world, their own ideas about judgment, the soul, Ma'at, and the afterlife. But they reveal something deeply human. People living in complex societies knew that survival depended on more than armies, monuments, and kings. It depended on whether people could be trusted not to steal the food that kept everyone else alive. And if a stolen sack of grain could weigh down a heart after death, what about the things people steal without ever touching a storehouse? A reputation, a promise, a child's safety, the truth itself. The next declarations begin moving into that darker territory. 7. I have not taken offerings. And before the text moves fully into lies, insults, betrayal, and the hidden damage people do to one another, it stops at another kind of theft. I have not taken offerings. At first, that may sound like a variation on stealing grain. Food is food, property is property, and theft is theft. But in ancient Egypt, an offering was not ordinary food sitting in an ordinary storehouse. It had been given to a god. Bread, beer, meat, fruit, incense, linen, oil, flowers, even small crafted objects could be brought before the divine image in a temple or left for the dead in a tomb. These gifts helped maintain a relationship between the human world and the sacred world. People gave so that the gods would continue to protect Egypt, sustain the Nile, preserve the harvest, defend the king, and keep Ma'at alive against the forces of chaos. So taking an offering was not just grabbing a loaf from a table. It meant reaching into a space that had been set apart. It meant taking something that someone had dedicated to a god, or perhaps to a dead relative whose continued existence depended, at least symbolically, on nourishment and remembrance. Think about what that would mean in a temple economy. Egypt's major temples were not tiny private shrines. They could control land, livestock, workshops, storehouses, priests, servants, and enormous quantities of food. Offerings arrived every day. Some were placed before the god's statue during ritual. Others supported the priests and workers whose job was to keep the temple operating. And yes, much of that food was later redistributed. The gods did not physically consume every loaf of bread or jar of beer. But that does not mean the offerings were meaningless. The ritual had transformed them. They had entered the sacred economy. There were rules, schedules, records, and responsibilities surrounding where they went next. If someone secretly removed an offering, they were not simply taking food. They were interfering with the proper exchange between people, gods, temple workers, and the dead. Imagine a hungry labourer slipping a piece of bread from a temple table. We can understand the desperation. Ancient people knew hunger as sharply as anyone. But from the perspective of the declaration, the question was not whether a person could invent an excuse. The question was whether they had violated the boundary between what was theirs and what belonged to the sacred order. That is the recurring pattern in the negative confessions. The dead person is not asked whether they were clever. They are asked whether they preserved ma'at. Did you take what had been entrusted to the gods? Did you treat sacred things as if they existed only for your private appetite? Could your heart deny it when weighed before the divine judges? And there is something almost unsettling about that question. Offerings are usually given in public, priests are present, ritual words are spoken, incense rises, but theft often happens in silence. A hand reaches out after everyone leaves. A record is adjusted. A delivery becomes slightly smaller. A basket disappears before it reaches its destination. The person may think no one saw, but Egyptian religion was built around the idea that the hidden act still mattered. The gods were not fooled by darkness, locked doors, or missing witnesses. Death would eventually bring the thief into the Hall of Two Truths, where even a stolen offering could become part of the evidence carried by the heart. And if this kind of ancient mystery pulls you in, our channel's book on the 12 Unexplained Mysteries is available through the website link in the description. Because the deeper you go into the ancient world, the more you realize that people thousands of years ago were wrestling with questions that still haunt us now. What is sacred? Who is watching? And what happens when no one else knows what you did? Still, taking an offering was only one level of the offense. The next declaration goes even further, because now the dead person is not merely denying that they took something placed before a god. They are denying that they stole from the god directly. 8. I have not stolen divine property. I have not stolen divine property. Now we are entering dangerous ground. An offering could be bread, beer, incense, or cloth brought into a temple for ritual use. But divine property was broader. It could include temple land, livestock, tools, vessels, precious metals, storehouse goods, sacred equipment, and the income produced by estates dedicated to a deity. In other words, temples were not only places of worship. They were major institutions. They owned resources. They employed people. They received taxes, gifts, rents, and harvests. A god might be imagined as the owner, while priests, scribes, administrators, farmers, herders, and craftsmen managed what belonged to that god on earth. So when the declaration says, I have not stolen divine property, it is not talking about some vague spiritual crime. It is talking about a real act with real consequences. Take grain from a temple estate, and fewer rations may reach the workers. Take linen meant for ritual, and the daily ceremonies are disrupted. Take cattle, metal, oil, or tools, and someone else must absorb the loss. Falsify an account, shift a boundary stone, hide part of a harvest, redirect a delivery into your own household, and you're not just cheating an institution. You are taking from a god. That was a terrifying idea in ancient Egypt, because the gods were not distant abstractions. They were woven into the structure of the world. Amun, Ra, Osiris, Hathor, Ptah, and countless others were connected to the forces that made life possible. The temple was where human beings performed their side of the relationship, feeding the god, clothing the god, praising the god, and maintaining the rituals that kept divine order flowing into the world. To steal temple property was to say, in effect, that your own greed mattered more than that order. And that is why this declaration is more than an ancient version of do not steal. Ordinary theft harms an owner. Theft of divine property threatens the relationship between the community and the sacred power believed to protect it. It was property crime, religious offence, and social sabotage all at once. Picture a scribe responsible for recording deliveries from temple fields. He receives 100 sacks of grain. On the papyrus, he writes 100, but perhaps only 95 arrive at the storehouse. The other 5 have been diverted, sold, or carried quietly to someone's home. 5 sacks. Maybe nobody notices this week. Maybe the records are complicated. Maybe the official above him is corrupt too. Maybe the temple is rich enough to survive it. But that is how systems decay. A missing measure becomes a missing ration. A missing ration becomes resentment. Resentment becomes distrust. And distrust is the beginning of Isfet, the Egyptian word for disorder, falsehood, and the chaos always waiting at the edge of civilization. The negative confessions insist that none of this is too small for judgment. The dead person cannot say, "It belonged to a powerful temple, so it did not matter." They cannot say, "The god had plenty." They cannot say, "I only took a little." Before the divine court, the question remains brutally simple. Did you steal what was not yours, even when its owner was a god? Once again, this should not be forced into a simplistic claim that Egypt had already produced the biblical commandments, or that Moses merely copied them from a temple text. Spell 125 is a funerary declaration of innocence, not a proven source for Sinai. Its wording varies across manuscripts, and it belongs to a distinct Egyptian vision of death, divine judgment, and Marat. But the moral logic is unmistakable. A society cannot endure if its sacred trusts can be plundered by anyone with access to the keys. And soon the declarations will turn from what people steal with their hands to what they steal with their voices. Because property can vanish from a storehouse, but truth can vanish from an entire society. 9. I have not uttered lies. I have not uttered lies. After theft comes something even harder to measure. A missing loaf leaves an empty space. A stolen vessel can be counted. A diverted sack of grain may show up in a ledger. But a lie can move through a city without leaving a mark on anything physical. It can pass from mouth to mouth, office to office, household to household, until nobody remembers where it began. And in ancient Egypt, that made lying more than a private flaw. Truth was bound to Ma'at. Ma'at was one of the great ideas at the center of Egyptian civilization. The word can mean truth, justice, balance, rightness, order, but it was bigger than any single English translation. Ma'at was the proper condition of the universe, the sun rising when it should, the Nile bringing life, the king ruling justly, courts judging fairly, families honoring obligations, workers receiving their rations, people speaking truth instead of poisoning the world with deception. The opposite was Isfet, disorder, violence, falsehood, chaos. So when the dead person stands in the Hall of Two Truths and declares, "I have not uttered lies," they are not merely saying, "I was usually honest." They are claiming something much more dangerous. I did not add chaos to the world. Think about daily life in a society dependent on records, officials, harvest measurements, tax assessments, labor assignments, and temple deliveries. A dishonest word could have consequences far beyond an awkward conversation. A scribe could alter a number, a witness could accuse an innocent person. A merchant could misrepresent a weight, an official could promise rations that never arrived. A neighbour could spread a rumour that destroyed a family's standing. One lie, and perhaps someone loses grain. Another lie, and perhaps someone loses their land. A false accusation, and perhaps someone loses everything. This is why truthfulness was not treated as some optional virtue for especially good people. It was the glue holding the system together. Egypt was a kingdom of farms, workshops, temples, riverboats, storehouses, and bureaucratic records. People had to believe that the measure was correct, that the messenger carried the right order, that the witness spoke honestly, that the official did not turn justice into a weapon. Without truth, every agreement becomes fragile. And this is where the declaration becomes intensely personal. The Egyptian dead person could not simply point to public achievements. They could not say, "I built a tomb, I gave gifts, I knew powerful people." In the divine court, the question was more intimate. When it served you to bend reality, did you do it? When a lie could protect your wealth, elevate your status, embarrass an enemy, or hide your own wrongdoing, did you speak it? Because your heart knew. That is the terrifying logic behind the weighing of the heart. The heart was not only an organ, it was the seat of memory, intention, character, and moral knowledge. You might fool a neighbour. You might fool a judge. You might even fool yourself, but your own heart carried the record. And before Matt, false words had weight. That does not prove Egypt invented later commandments, or that the negative confessions were copied into another tradition. Spell 125 belongs to its own Egyptian world. But it reveals a moral insight that is ancient and still painfully recognizable. A civilization can survive hunger. It can survive floods. It can rebuild after war. But when people no longer trust words, everything begins to break. And the next declaration brings us back to food. Not sacred offerings. Not temple wealth. The basic provisions that kept ordinary people alive. 10. I have not carried away food. I have not carried away food. At first, this may sound almost too ordinary. Food, surely this is just another version of theft. But in ancient Egypt, food was never merely food. It was survival measured in loaves, jars, baskets, cuts of meat, onions, dates, fish, grain, and beer. It was the difference between a household enduring the season and a household slipping toward disaster. Egypt was rich because the Nile could produce abundance. But that abundance depended on timing, labour, storage, transport, and careful distribution. The harvest had to be gathered, grain had to be measured, supplies had to be protected from pests, spoilage, corruption, and theft. And for many people, payment itself came in food. Workers might receive grain rations. Labourers could depend on bread and beer. Temple personnel, officials, craftsmen, boat crews, and farming households all relied on systems that moved stored provisions from one place to another. A few missing sacks from a storehouse might not ruin a wealthy official. But for the people waiting for their ration, it could mean hunger. That is why I have not carried away food has such force. Picture a worker returning home after a long day. His household has counted on the grain allotted to him. There are children to feed, an elderly parent, a spouse who has stretched yesterday's bread as far as possible. But somewhere along the chain, a portion has disappeared. Maybe a storehouse guard took it. Maybe a delivery was short. Maybe someone with authority quietly redirected supplies to their own home. To the thief it may have looked like a small amount. To the household that lost it, it was everything. And notice the wording, carried away. It suggests movement, hands taking what should have remained. A basket lifted. A sack shifted. A ration removed from the path between the storehouse and the people who needed it. Theft is often imagined as a dramatic act, someone breaking in under cover of darkness. But this is more familiar than that. It is the small disappearance. The little extra taken because no one is looking. The portion shaved off because the records are complicated. The food carried away from people who may never know who took it. In a society built around stored supplies, this was not just personal greed. It was an attack on the fragile trust that allowed thousands of people to cooperate. Farmers had to trust that their harvest would be accounted for. Workers had to trust that promised rations would arrive. Households had to trust that officials managing supplies were not feeding themselves first. When that trust failed, hunger was not far behind. The negative confessions keep returning to this principle. Harm does not need to be spectacular to matter. You do not have to burn a village or rob a temple treasury to violate Mat. Sometimes disorder begins with a loaf of bread that never reaches the person it was meant to feed, and the deceased, standing before the divine judges, must make the declaration without excuses. I did not take provisions from the vulnerable. I did not make my comfort depend on someone else's hunger. I did not carry away what kept another household alive, because in the Hall of Two Truths, even a stolen ration could become evidence. And now the declarations move beyond food and property into something more personal still. The injuries people inflict not with their hands, but with cruelty, anger, and abuse of power. 11. I have not been sullen. I have not been sullen. This is one of the strangest declarations in the entire collection. Not murderous, not violent, not obviously criminal. Sullen. At first glance, it sounds almost trivial. A bad mood. A dark face. Someone sitting silently in the corner, refusing to speak. But ancient moral language often carries more weight than its modern translation suggests. This statement may point beyond ordinary sadness and towards something more destructive. Resentment turned outward, hostility toward others, a refusal to participate in the bonds that held a community together. In other words, this is not necessarily, I was never unhappy. It may be closer to, I did not become a source of bitterness, conflict, and disruption among other people. Think about what daily life required in ancient Egypt. Families worked together. Farming depended on seasons and shared labour. Building projects required crews to cooperate. Boats moved goods along the Nile. Temples, workshops, storehouses, and households all depended on people carrying out obligations that affected someone else. A person consumed by resentment could damage that system without ever stealing a single loaf or telling a direct lie. They could withhold help. They could turn every conversation into an insult. They could spread tension through a household. They could make cooperation impossible, poison friendships, provoke quarrels, and turn small disagreements into lasting feuds. That kind of hostility has consequences. It may not appear in a grain ledger. No official can weigh it in a storehouse, but everyone around it feels it. And perhaps that is why it appears among these declarations of innocence. The Egyptian vision of Mat was not limited to dramatic crimes. Order could be broken by theft, violence, dishonesty, and abuse. But it could also be weakened by the attitudes that made people unwilling to live responsibly with one another. Imagine standing before the divine assessors after death. You have escaped the obvious accusations. You did not steal. You did not kill. You did not take food from the hungry. But then comes this quieter question. What did your presence do to other people? Did you bring stability, or did you bring friction? Did you carry anger everywhere you went? Did your grudges become everyone else's burden? The heart, in Egyptian thought, remembered more than public acts. It remembered intention, character, the things a person said and did when nobody important was watching. That is what makes this declaration unsettling. It suggests that moral failure was not only about what you took from others, it was also about what you brought into their lives. And that brings us to a declaration, involving one of the most private, volatile, and socially dangerous areas of human behavior, sexual conduct. 12. I have not committed adultery. I have not committed adultery. Now the negative confessions enter territory where private desire could become a public disaster. Adultery is never only about two people, not in a small household. Not in a village where everyone knows everyone, and certainly not in an ancient society where marriage, inheritance, children, property, family alliances, and household stability could all be tied together. A sexual relationship outside accepted boundaries could create jealousy, conflict, uncertainty over parentage, disputes over inheritance, and violence between families. It could fracture the very networks people depended on for survival. So when the deceased declares, "I have not committed adultery," this is not simply an ancient version of modern romantic morality. It is a claim about not violating trust, but we need to be careful here. The Egyptian Book of the Dead is not a single legal code. Spell 125 is not a courtroom statute book handed down by a central government. These are declarations of innocence spoken by the dead before divine judges, preserved in texts that varied across time and place. Egyptian ideas about marriage, sex, status, and punishment were complex, and they do not map neatly onto modern assumptions. Still, the concern is unmistakable. Sexual conduct could disrupt Maat, because Maat was not abstract philosophy floating above ordinary life. It was order inside the home as much as order in the cosmos. It was trust between spouses, peace between households, children protected from chaos, promises not treated as meaningless when desire became inconvenient. And this is where the declaration becomes uncomfortable, because it asks a question people have been asking for thousands of years. What do you owe another person when nobody is forcing you to be faithful? No guard may be present, no official may see, no ledger records the act. But the Egyptian dead person is still expected to answer before the divine court. I did not betray the bonds that gave others security. That does not mean the Egyptians had invented a modern universal sexual ethic. They had not. Nor does the existence of this confession prove that Moses borrowed a commandment directly from Egypt. Similar moral concerns can appear in different cultures without one text being copied from another. But it does reveal something important. Long before Sinai became the setting for a later sacred law tradition, Egyptian funerary texts already imagined the dead defending their conduct in matters of loyalty, trust, and sexual restraint. And if you want to explore more ancient questions that refuse to stay buried, the channel's book on the 12 Unexplained Mysteries is available through the website link in the description. Because the deeper mystery here is not that ancient people cared about adultery, it is that they understood its consequences. A broken promise can remain private for a while. But eventually, like a lie, like stolen food, like resentment left to grow, it spreads outward. And the next declarations continue this disturbing pattern, exposing how violence against order can begin in acts people may think no one else will ever know. 13. I have not defiled another man's wife. I have not defiled another man's wife. At first, this may sound like the declaration we have just covered. I have not committed adultery. So why say it again? Because the negative confessions do not always speak in broad modern categories. They zoom in, they name the damage from another angle. And this formula brings the focus directly onto the household. Not just desire, not just betrayal. The household. In ancient Egypt, a household was not simply a place where people slept. It was an economic unit, a family line, a place where food was stored, children were raised, property was managed, and obligations passed from one generation to the next. Disrupt one marriage, and you could disrupt far more than a private relationship. You could create uncertainty over inheritance, You could provoke a feud between men and families. You could endanger a woman's position inside her own home. You could throw children into a conflict they did not create. You could turn neighbours into enemies. And in a world without modern institutions waiting to catch people when everything collapsed, those consequences could be severe. That is what makes the wording important. The speaker does not merely say, "I did not pursue pleasure." He says, "I did not defile another man's wife." The language reflects an ancient society structured very differently from our own, including unequal assumptions about gender, marriage, and household authority. We should not sanitize that. Egyptian society was not modern, and these declarations were not written as a universal charter of equality. But within its own setting, the statement reveals a powerful concern. Do not violate the trust that holds another household together. Think about the social reality behind it. You live in a town along the Nile. People know who belongs to which family. They know whose fields border whose. They know which households trade with one another, work together, borrow grain during hard years, arrange marriages, and depend on each other when the river fails or sickness comes. Then one secret relationship begins. Maybe nobody knows at first. Maybe it seems like a private choice between two people. But secrets have a way of becoming public. A glance is noticed. A rumour moves through the market. A husband hears. Relatives take sides. Questions begin over loyalty, parentage, property, honour, and revenge. One hidden act becomes a fire moving through dry grass, and the Egyptian dead person standing before the divine court is expected to deny that he ever lit that fire. "I did not defile another man's wife." That does not prove a direct line from Egyptian funerary religion to the commandment traditions associated with Moses. Similar rules about marriage and sexual boundaries appear across many ancient cultures because families everywhere faced the same human dangers: jealousy, betrayal, violence, inheritance disputes, and broken trust. But it does mean that, centuries before the biblical Sinai story took its familiar form, Egyptian religious texts were already treating sexual conduct as a matter with consequences beyond the bedroom. The heart would be weighed, and apparently private betrayals were not private to the heart. They left marks on the whole community. But if this confession warns against a hidden act that can destroy peace inside a household, the next one goes even further. It confronts the person who does not merely create conflict in secret. It confronts the person who makes other people afraid. 14. I have not caused terror. I have not caused terror. This is one of those statements that feels shockingly modern. Not because ancient Egypt had the modern idea of terrorism. It did not. We should not force a 21st century political meaning onto an ancient translation. But because the moral question behind it is timeless. Did you use fear as a weapon against other people? Did you make your strength into their weakness? Did people change their behaviour because they were afraid of what you might do? Imagine what that could mean in an ancient community. A powerful official threatening workers, a supervisor intimidating labourers who could not fight back, a wealthy man making poor families fear for their food or shelter, a neighbour with a reputation for violence, a person who spread rumours, made threats, bullied the vulnerable, and created an atmosphere where everyone walked carefully around them. No blood may have been spilled, no property may have been stolen, but terror had still been caused, and terror destroys order in a special way. Theft takes something from a person. Violence injures a person. But fear can take over an entire community. It changes how people speak. It changes whom they trust. It makes neighbours stay silent when they should help each other. It makes the weak feel isolated. It allows the cruel to rule without needing to strike every day. That is why this declaration belongs in a vision of Ma'at. Ma'at was balance, truth, justice, proper order, and a society ruled by fear cannot be balanced. People may obey, but obedience is not the same thing as peace. They may remain quiet, but silence is not the same thing as harmony. The deceased must stand before divine assessors and make an extraordinary claim. I did not make others live in dread of me. That is a much higher standard than simply saying, I avoided major crimes. It asks what your presence did to the people around you. When you entered a room, did people feel safe? When you held power, did you use it fairly? When someone weaker than you made a mistake, did you correct them? Or did you make them afraid? These are not abstract questions. In a world built on hierarchy, labour, households, temples, and state authority, the abuse of power was always possible. Egypt had kings, officials, priests, landowners, foremen, soldiers and masters of households. Whenever one person had control over another person's work, food, freedom, or reputation, fear could become a tool. And the negative confessions say that this tool could stain the heart. That is remarkable, because it means Egyptian morality was not concerned only with visible acts. It was concerned with the emotional climate a person created, the atmosphere around their authority, the difference between leadership and intimidation. You can force people to obey. You can threaten them into silence. You can make yourself powerful by making everyone else feel small. But in the Hall of Two Truths, none of that looks like strength. It looks like disorder, and that raises an even darker question. If causing terror was condemned, what about the people who turned fear into direct violence? What about those who used force not just to intimidate, but to injure, exploit, and destroy? The next declarations are about to take us deeper into that territory. 15. I have not transgressed. I have not transgressed. After declarations about adultery, terror, violence, theft, and deception, this one can seem almost too broad. I have not transgressed. Transgressed against what? The answer is everything that Ma'at was meant to protect. Truth, balance, justice. The proper boundary between what a person was allowed to do and what they had no right to do. That is what makes this declaration so important. The negative confessions are not just a collection of separate offences, like a criminal code with neat categories and fixed penalties. They are part of a much larger moral universe, a universe in which every human action could either support order or push the world closer to disorder. And disorder was not a small thing to the ancient Egyptians. The Nile had to rise, the crops had to grow, families had to remain stable. Courts had to judge fairly, workers had to receive what they were owed. Temples had to perform their rituals. The king had to rule justly. The dead had to be judged truthfully. If these things failed, it was not merely bad administration. It was a rupture in the proper order of creation. So when the deceased says, I have not transgressed, he is making a sweeping claim. I did not cross the line. I did not knowingly become a source of chaos. Think about how many forms that could take. Maybe you did not steal from a neighbour. But did you cheat him in a trade? Maybe you did not strike a weaker person. But did you use your status to deny them justice? Maybe you did not openly lie. But did you twist the truth when it benefited you? Maybe you performed every religious duty expected of you. But did you carry corruption into the way you treated other people? That is the danger of a broad declaration like this. It leaves fewer hiding places. A person can sometimes defend one isolated act. They can say, it was a misunderstanding, or everyone did it, or I had no choice, but I have not transgressed reaches beyond excuses. It asks whether the pattern of your life respected the limits that made communal life possible. And those limits were not invented in one moment by one people. Every ancient society had to confront the same problem. How do you keep human appetite, anger, greed, desire, and power from tearing the group apart? Egypt answered through Ma'at. Israelite tradition would answer through covenant, commandment, and divine law. Other cultures answered in other ways. The similarities can be striking. But striking similarity is not proof of direct borrowing. Spell 125 is an Egyptian funerary text, and its negative confessions are declarations of innocence before divine judges, not evidence that Moses simply copied Egyptian ideas at Sinai. Still, the question remains fascinating. How old is the human realization that freedom without boundaries can become destruction? If you want to go deeper into questions like that, our book on the 12 Unexplained Mysteries is available through the website link in the description. Because I have not transgressed is not really about one forbidden act. It is about the invisible line between living among other people and living at their expense. And once that line is crossed, it often begins with something that seems far smaller than murder, theft, or terror. It can begin with a flash of anger. 16. I have not been angry without cause. I have not been angry without cause. Notice the wording. It does not say, I have never been angry. That would be impossible. Anger is human. A person can be angry at betrayal, angry at injustice, angry when a child is harmed, when a neighbour is cheated, when the powerful abuse the weak. Even in the ancient world, people understood that not every surge of anger was the same. The confession condemns something more specific, anger without cause, anger that is excessive, anger that erupts because pride was wounded, anger that looks for someone weaker to punish, anger that turns a small insult into a lifelong feud. This is a surprisingly precise moral distinction. The problem is not the feeling itself. The problem is whether the feeling is rooted in truth and proportion, or whether it has become another form of disorder. Imagine a crowded worksite during harvest season. Everyone is exhausted. The grain has to be gathered before weather ruins it. A worker makes a mistake. Maybe he drops a tool, maybe he misunderstands an order, maybe he is simply too slow. A fair supervisor corrects him. An unjust one explodes, he shouts. He humiliates the worker in front of everyone. He threatens him. He makes the mistake larger than it was because he wants everyone watching to fear him. That is anger without cause. Or think of a household. A man returns home frustrated by a dispute at the market, a bad harvest, a debt, an insult from someone above him in status. He cannot strike the official who humiliated him. He cannot command the river to rise. So he carries that anger home and releases it on the people least able to resist. His wife, his children, a servant, a poorer relative. Nothing has been solved. The original injustice remains. But now suffering has multiplied. The Egyptians understood that this kind of rage was not private. Like terror, it changes the atmosphere around a person. People begin measuring every word. They become cautious, silent, watchful. A home stops feeling safe. A workplace becomes a place of dread. A community learns that one person's moods can become everyone else's danger. And that violates Ma'at, because Ma'at demanded balance. Anger without cause is imbalance inside the human heart, spilling outward into the world. That does not mean ancient Egypt was a peaceful society free of conflict. It was not. Egyptians fought wars, punished crimes, enforced hierarchy, and lived with harsh inequalities. The ideal written in a funerary confession is not always the same as daily reality. But ideals matter precisely because reality falls short of them. When the dead person stood in the Hall of Two Truths and declared innocence, he was not merely saying, "I did not lose my temper." He was saying, "I did not make my emotions into a weapon. That is a standard many people would struggle to meet, because unjustified anger rarely announces itself as unjustified. It tells us we are right. It tells us the other person deserves what is coming. It turns irritation into certainty, certainty into cruelty, and cruelty into regret. But in the Egyptian vision of judgment, the heart remembers. It remembers every time power was used to humiliate, every time rage was poured onto someone who did not deserve it, every time a person chose to restore balance or destroy it. And that leads to another confession with an even sharper edge. What happens when anger is no longer just a feeling? What happens when it becomes violence? 17. I have not killed sacred cattle. I have not killed sacred cattle. At first, this might sound like one of the stranger declarations in the entire list. Why cattle? Why would the killing of a particular animal stand beside murder, theft, adultery, violence, and falsehood? Because in ancient Egypt, cattle were never just cattle. They were wealth, they were food, they were labour. They pulled ploughs through the fields, they helped turn the Nile's annual flood into grain, bread, beer, taxes, temple offerings, and survival for entire communities. A herd was not merely a collection of animals, it was stored prosperity on 4 legs. But some cattle carried an even deeper significance. They belonged to divine estates. Temple institutions owned land, workers, storehouses, flocks and herds. These resources supported the rituals believed to maintain the relationship between Egypt, its gods, and the ordered universe itself. An animal assigned to a god's estate was not simply available for anyone who happened to be hungry, angry, desperate, or greedy. It had a protected purpose. To kill it without authority was not just taking meat. It was stealing from a sacred institution. It was damaging an economic system. It was violating a boundary between ordinary property and what had been set apart for the divine. And that tells us something important about the world behind the negative confessions. Ancient Egyptian morality was not limited to what happened inside your own home. Your actions touched households, farms, markets, temples, officials, labourers, and the gods. The world was a web of obligations. Pull too hard on one thread, and the damage could spread far beyond the original act. Picture a farmer during a difficult season. The river has not risen as generously as everyone hoped. Grain stores are lower than they should be. His own animals are weak. Then he sees cattle grazing on temple land, animals that look healthier than his own. One animal could feed his family. One animal could be sold. One animal could solve a problem that has been growing for months. But it does not belong to him, and in the Egyptian moral imagination, that fact matters. Need does not automatically erase obligation. Power does not automatically create permission. And sacred property was not protected merely because priests wanted more wealth. It was protected because the Egyptians believed order depended on people recognizing limits. Not every animal was sacred. Not every killing was forbidden. Egyptians ate meat, offered animals in ritual, and depended on livestock. This confession is more specific than a blanket prohibition. The issue was unlawful destruction, taking what belonged to a divine estate, treating something entrusted to the gods as if it were yours to use. That is why the declaration belongs here. I have not killed sacred cattle is really another way of saying, I did not violate what was under protection. And once a person learns to ignore protected boundaries, the next step is often easier. Maybe they do not take an animal. Maybe they take something less visible. A little extra grain in a trade, a false promise, a dishonest measure. And suddenly, the damage is hidden inside a transaction. 18. I have not committed fraud. I have not committed fraud. This one is almost uncomfortably modern. Fraud. Not robbery in the night, not violence in the street, not a weapon, a threat, or an obvious act of theft. Fraud is quieter than that. It smiles. It shakes hands. It writes down the wrong number. It uses a false measure at the market and hopes no one notices. And in a civilization as dependent on trade, harvest accounts, labour obligations, taxation, and stored grain as ancient Egypt, deception in daily dealings could poison everything. Imagine buying grain. You bring what little silver, copper, cloth, or barter goods you have. The seller fills a basket, weighs it, and assures you the amount is fair. But the basket has been altered, the scale has been weighted. The grain at the top looks clean, while the bottom is full of husks and dust. Maybe the buyer loses only a little, but do that to 100 people, 1,000. Now, one person's dishonesty becomes hunger somewhere else. Or imagine an official recording taxes after harvest. A village owes a certain amount. The scribes measure the fields, count the grain, and enter the totals. If someone inflates the numbers, skims from the stores, or falsely claims that a worker failed to deliver what he did deliver, the victim may have little power to challenge the record. The fraud is not private. It can mean debt, punishment, forced labour, a family losing the grain meant to carry them through the dry months. That is why this declaration is not simply saying, I made no mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. A calculation can be wrong. A scale can slip. A shipment can spoil. A promise can fail because events change. Fraud is different. Fraud requires intention. It is the decision to create an appearance of fairness while secretly taking advantage of another person. And that was a violation of Maat, because Maat was not only about grand cosmic order, stars in their courses, the Nile flood, kingship, temples, and divine judgment. It also lived in the smallest human exchanges, the correct weight. The honest account, the promise kept, the wage delivered. The boundary respected. That is the remarkable thing about these negative confessions. They move constantly between the enormous and the ordinary. One moment the deceased is declaring innocence before divine judges. The next, the moral test may be something as simple as whether he cheated another person in a deal, and perhaps that is where morality is hardest. Most people do not wake up intending to become villains. They tell themselves it is only a small deception, only this once, only because everyone else does it, only because the other person will never know. But the Egyptians saw the larger danger. Every dishonest exchange teaches a community that trust is foolish, and when trust disappears, people stop cooperating. They guard what they have. They suspect every promise. They begin preparing for betrayal before betrayal has even happened. That is chaos. That is the opposite of Maat. So when the deceased declares, I have not committed fraud, he is not merely claiming clean hands. He is claiming that he did not turn another person's trust into an opportunity for profit. And in the Hall of Two Truths, where even the heart could speak against its owner, that was not a small claim at all. 19. I have not pried into matters. I have not pried into matters. After fraud, this confession takes us somewhere quieter. Not into the market, not into a temple storehouse, not into a courtroom, into the private spaces between people. Because every society has information that does not belong to everyone. A family has disputes, a merchant has accounts, an official has records. A neighbour has grief, illness, debts, secrets, suspicions and fears. And ancient Egyptians understood that forcing your way into another person's affairs could create real harm. To pry into matters was not harmless curiosity. It could mean listening where you were not meant to listen, questioning people for information you had no right to demand, searching for weakness, collecting rumours, taking a private problem and carrying it into public view. Think about how easily this could become dangerous in a tightly connected village along the Nile. Everyone knows everyone. Everyone sees who comes and goes, who has received extra grain, whose daughter is promised in marriage, whose fields produced less than expected, whose household is arguing behind closed doors. In that kind of world, information has power. Maybe you learn that a neighbour cannot pay a debt. Maybe you hear that an official is under investigation. Maybe you discover that a family is hiding a shameful event, something that could damage their standing if it spreads. You could keep your distance, or you could turn their vulnerability into entertainment, into gossip, into leverage, into a weapon. That is the moral boundary this declaration seems to recognize. I have not pried into matters is not saying that Egyptians believed nobody should ever investigate wrongdoing. Officials had duties, courts required testimony, communities needed witnesses when crimes occurred. But there is a difference between seeking truth for justice and digging into another person's life because you enjoy the power of knowing what they want hidden. That difference still matters, and it fits the larger logic of the negative confessions in Spell 125. These are not a modern legal code. They are declarations of innocence spoken by the deceased before the divine judges. They reveal ideals. A person should not disturb the order of life by exploiting other people's weaknesses, property, bodies, labour, trust or privacy. In other words, Mart required limits. You were not entitled to take what belonged to someone else. Not their grain, not their cattle, not their honest reputation, and not every secret they carried. There is something surprisingly mature in that idea. A community cannot survive on trust alone if every private struggle becomes public property. People need room to make mistakes, settle disputes, mourn losses, and protect their dignity without someone standing nearby, waiting to turn pain into a story. And speaking of mysteries hidden beneath the surface, our channel's book on 12 unexplained mysteries explores some of history's most baffling questions. You can find it through the website link in the description. But the Egyptians knew that privacy could be destroyed without breaking into a house or stealing a document. Sometimes all it took was a mouth. One careless question, one repeated rumour, one person speaking far more than wisdom allowed. 20. I have not spoken excessively, I have not spoken excessively. At first, this may sound almost too simple. Really, in a list that includes murder, theft, fraud, violence, and betrayal, why would talking too much matter? Because words can do damage long after the speaker has forgotten saying them. Ancient Egypt was a world of reputation. Your name mattered. Your family standing mattered. Your ability to make agreements, find work, marry, trade, testify, and receive help in hard times could depend on what people believed about you. And reckless speech could destroy all of that. Imagine a dispute at the market. Two sellers claim the same basket of goods. Tempers rise. People gather. One man begins talking loudly, confidently, endlessly. He does not know all the facts, but that does not stop him. He accuses, he exaggerates, he repeats hearsay as if he saw it himself. By the time the truth is discovered, the damage is already done. Someone's reputation has been stained. A business relationship has collapsed. A family has become suspicious of another family. Maybe an innocent person now faces an official's attention because one loud voice filled the air with claims nobody thought to question. That is excessive speech, not simply speaking often, not telling stories, not giving advice, not participating in public life. The problem is speech without restraint, words poured out without care for truth, consequence, timing, or the dignity of the people being discussed. A person who speaks excessively may reveal secrets. They may boast, they may insult, they may provoke fights that did not need to happen. They may promise more than they can deliver. They may bury the truth under a flood of noise. And in legal settings this mattered enormously. Egypt had scribes, records, petitions, witnesses, officials, and courts. A false or uncontrolled statement could affect property, punishment, labour obligations, and status. Words were not just sounds disappearing into the desert air. They could become testimony, they could become records, they could become consequences. So this declaration is really about self-mastery. Can you control your tongue when anger rises? Can you stay silent when you do not know enough? Can you refuse to repeat a rumour just because it makes you feel important? Can you speak truth without turning truth into cruelty? That is a difficult moral test in any age, and it is worth remembering that the deceased in spell 125 is not claiming perfection in some casual sense. He is standing before divine judgment, making declarations of innocence while his heart is weighed against Ma'at. Every careless word, every rumour, every boast, every accusation, every secret exposed for pleasure or advantage, all of it could become part of the weight carried by that heart. I have not spoken excessively means I did not let my words become chaos. And that phrase takes us deeper into the Egyptian moral universe. Chaos was not always a monster with claws. Sometimes it arrived as a dishonest scale. Sometimes as a stolen animal. Sometimes as a neighbour prying into private pain. And sometimes it arrived through a human voice that would not stop talking. 21. I have not committed treason. I have not committed treason. After all the warnings about speech, secrets, and the damage a single person can do to another, this declaration expands the scale. Now the question is not just whether you harmed a neighbour. It is whether you helped endanger the whole order of the land. In ancient Egypt, loyalty was not merely a political preference. It was sacred. The king was not viewed as an ordinary ruler who happened to control an army and collect taxes. He was understood to have a unique role in preserving Ma'at, the balance that held Egypt together. He defended the land from enemies. He maintained temples. He ensured justice was carried out. He made offerings to the gods. He stood, at least in theory, between the ordered world of Egypt and the forces of chaos pressing in from beyond its borders. So to betray rightful authority was more than a crime against one man. It was a wound in the structure of the universe. That does not mean every Egyptian loved every official, or that every king ruled wisely. Ancient Egypt had corruption, ambition, conspiracies, power struggles and rebellions, just like every other civilization. Palace intrigue was real. Officials could abuse power. Dynasties rose and fell. But the ideal remained powerful. A stable Egypt meant the Nile could be managed, fields could be measured, grain could be stored, trade could move, courts could function, temples could perform the rituals believed necessary to sustain life itself. When authority collapsed, nobody knew what might follow. Imagine a local official entrusted with grain during a poor harvest. Instead of distributing it fairly, he secretly allies himself with rivals, hides supplies, spreads panic, and encourages people to turn against the administration. Maybe he hopes to gain power. Maybe he has been promised wealth. Maybe he simply believes chaos will give him a chance to settle old scores. But the consequences would reach far beyond his personal ambition. Families could go hungry. Labourers could lose work. Violence could spread. Trust between communities could disappear. And if Egypt could not defend its borders or maintain its internal order, foreign raiders, rival claimants, and desperate opportunists might see their opening. That is why I have not committed treason carries such weight. The exact wording and interpretation of individual negative confessions can vary across translations, and we should not imagine spell 125 as a simple statute book. These are declarations of innocence made before divine judges. But this statement clearly points toward a moral fear of betrayal, using one's position, knowledge, or allegiance to undermine the order one was supposed to uphold. And there is an uncomfortable question beneath it. What do you owe a society that gives you protection, food systems, laws, roads, temples, and community? The Egyptian answer was not blind obedience to every powerful person. It was loyalty to Ma'at, to the idea that deliberate betrayal for selfish gain could unleash suffering far beyond the betrayer's own life. Because chaos rarely announces itself with an army at the gate. Sometimes it begins with one trusted person deciding that everyone else can pay the price. And from loyalty to the outer order of Egypt, the next declaration turns inward, to the condition of the person approaching the gods. 22. I have not polluted myself. I have not polluted myself. This one can sound strange to modern ears. What does it mean to pollute yourself? Was the deceased claiming never to be dirty, never sick, never touched by death, blood, childbirth, food, work, animals, or the 1,000 physical realities of life along the Nile? Not exactly. In ancient Egyptian religion, purity was often ritual, not simply personal hygiene. It involved being in the proper condition to approach sacred spaces, perform certain duties, take part in ceremonies, or stand before divine powers. And the meaning could shift depending on context. What counted as impurity for a temple priest preparing to serve a god was not necessarily the same thing that counted as wrongdoing for an ordinary farmer, artisan, soldier, or merchant. Contact with certain substances, bodily conditions, death, forbidden acts, or improper behavior could require cleansing before ritual participation. So when the deceased says, I have not polluted myself, the statement is not a neat modern commandment, with one obvious definition. It is part of a larger claim. I did not make myself unfit for the sacred order. Think about the journey described in spell 125. The dead person enters the Hall of Two Truths. Divine beings are present. The heart will be weighed against the feather of Ma'at. This is not a place for casual excuses. The deceased must show that they have not filled their life with actions that brought disorder, corruption, violence, deception, and spiritual uncleanness. Purity in that setting becomes about readiness. Are you fit to stand before truth? Have you respected the boundaries between the sacred and the careless? Have you treated your body, your obligations, and the divine world as if none of it mattered? For temple personnel, these questions could be extremely practical. Ritual washing, clean garments, dietary rules, sexual abstinence at particular times, and other preparations could be required before entering holy spaces. The god's temple was not an ordinary building. It was the god's earthly house. To approach it improperly was to disrupt the relationship between humans and the divine. But the negative confession reaches beyond priestly procedure. It connects purity to moral condition. A person can wash their hands and still carry a heavy heart. They can wear clean linen and still cheat a worker. They can recite the right prayers and still betray a friend. They can enter a temple and still bring chaos with them. That is the tension at the center of this declaration. The Egyptians cared about ritual preparation, but spell 125 also demands something deeper, a life that has not been corrupted by actions opposed to Ma'at. And this is where the phrase becomes surprisingly challenging, because pollution is not always visible. Sometimes it is greed that has become normal. Sometimes cruelty practiced so often it no longer feels cruel. Sometimes a lie repeated until the speaker believes it. Sometimes a person knows they have done wrong, but keeps moving through life as if no cleansing, no repair, no confession is needed. Before the divine judges, none of that can remain hidden. The outer body may be washed, but the heart is the thing placed on the scale. 23. I have not terrorized anyone. I have not terrorized anyone. After the heart, the next question is about fear. Not ordinary fear. Not the fear of a sudden storm on the Nile, a failed harvest, illness, or death. This is the fear one human being creates in another on purpose. The fear of the stronger person using strength against the weaker. The fear of an official who can ruin your livelihood with a word. The fear of a landowner, overseer, soldier, creditor, or neighbour who knows you cannot fight back. In some translations of the negative confessions, the wording differs. The ancient Egyptian phrases are not always easy to carry cleanly into English. But the moral force is clear enough. The deceased is declaring before the divine judges, "I did not make other people live in fear of me." That is a serious claim in a society built on hierarchy. Ancient Egypt was not an equal society, far from it. There was a king at the top, then powerful officials, priests, scribes, military leaders, landholders, skilled workers, labourers, and people with very little protection at all. Your position could shape almost every part of your life. What work you did, what food you had, who could command you, and whether anyone would listen if you were wronged. And wherever there is unequal power, there is the temptation to intimidate. Picture an overseer during harvest season. The grain has to be gathered before the flood cycle changes. Everyone is exhausted. The workers are already worried about their families, their rations, their debts. The overseer has authority. He can assign harder labour. He can report someone as lazy. He can withhold supplies. He can threaten punishment. Maybe nobody challenges him because they know what happens when they do. He does not need to strike anyone. He only has to make them believe that he could. That is terror. And the Egyptian moral imagination understood that this kind of power was dangerous. Not just politically dangerous, spiritually dangerous. Because Mart was not supposed to be maintained through arbitrary cruelty. Order was not meant to mean that the powerful could crush whoever stood below them. An official had duties, a judge had duties, a wealthy person had duties. Strength came with responsibility. The person who terrorized others was not simply being harsh. They were manufacturing chaos inside the community. They were turning workplaces, homes, fields and streets into places where trust could not survive. And once fear becomes normal, people begin to lie just to stay safe. They hide things. They betray one another. They obey injustice because resistance seems impossible. They stop believing fairness exists. That is how a society rots from the inside. So this declaration is not a proven ancient version of a later biblical commandment, and it does not demonstrate that Moses borrowed from Egypt. Spell 125 is not a legal code. It is a collection of declarations of innocence spoken by the dead before divine judges. But it shows that Egyptians could frame intimidation as a moral threat. Not merely did you break a rule, but did you use your power to make another person afraid? And that question gets even more uncomfortable when we move to the next confession. Because terror can be one great act of cruelty. Or it can become a habit. 24. I have not done wrong daily. I have not done wrong daily. At first, this sounds almost impossible. No person makes it through life without mistakes. No farmer gets every measure right. No merchant makes every bargain perfectly. No parent speaks with perfect patience. No official avoids every bad decision. No human being, ancient or modern, lives without regret. So what could this declaration mean? Was the deceased claiming absolute perfection? Probably not. The language of spell 125 is formal, ritual, and often sweeping. These are declarations made at the moment of ultimate judgment, when the heart is about to be weighed against the feather of Ma'ahat. The person is not offering a casual autobiography. They are making the strongest possible case that their life was not defined by actions that violated the moral order. And that word matters. Daily. The danger here is not one isolated failure. It is wrongdoing turned into routine. It is waking up every morning and choosing dishonesty because dishonesty works. It is cheating workers because you have learned nobody will stop you. It is taking a little extra grain, telling a little lie, humiliating someone weaker, ignoring someone hungry, abusing a position of trust, then doing it again tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. One bad act can be regretted. A repeated pattern becomes character. That is the warning inside this confession. Imagine a scribe responsible for recording grain deliveries. Every day he changes the numbers slightly, not enough to attract immediate attention. A few sacks here, a false mark there. Over months his theft becomes invisible to him. It is no longer a decision, it is simply how he works. But somewhere rations come up short. A household has less food. A worker is blamed for missing supplies. A family enters the dry season with nothing stored away. The scribe may never see their faces, but Matt sees the chain of consequences. That is why the Egyptian afterlife judgment is so unsettling. It assumes actions do not disappear just because they become familiar. You can normalize cruelty. You can call greed business. You can call corruption the way things are. You can call daily wrongdoing survival. But before the divine court, repetition does not make disorder acceptable. It makes it worse. And this is one reason the negative confessions remain so fascinating. They are not only concerned with spectacular evil, murder, treason, theft, violence. They also probe the ordinary patterns that quietly shape a life. What did you do when nobody was watching? What did you do when you had the advantage? What did you keep doing after you knew it was wrong? If you enjoy these ancient mysteries, the channel's book on 12 Unexplained Mysteries is available through the website link in the description. For the Egyptian deceased, the goal was not to prove they had never stumbled. It was to show that they had not made chaos their daily practice, because a life is not measured only by its worst moment. It is also measured by the choices repeated so often that they become the person standing before the scale. 25. I have not given way to rage. I have not given way to rage. After wrongdoing becomes a habit, the next danger is the emotion that can turn one bad moment into something much worse. Rage, not anger in the ordinary sense. Every human being gets angry. An Egyptian farmer could get angry when floodwaters ruined a field. A mother could get angry when food ran short. A worker could get angry at an unfair overseer. A judge could get angry when someone lied before the court. Anger itself was not the crime. The danger was giving way to it, letting it take control, letting it turn a disagreement into violence, letting humiliation become revenge, letting one insult become a beating, a false accusation, a ruined household, or a death that could never be undone. That is what this declaration is really about. The deceased stands before the divine judges and says, in effect, I was not ruled by the fire inside me, and that mattered in a world where people often lived under pressure. Ancient Egypt depended on the Nile. If the flood failed, everyone felt it. Grain became scarce. Taxes still had to be paid. Labour still had to be performed. Families could be separated by work, obligations, debt, illness or death. A single bad season could turn ordinary tensions into desperate conflict. Imagine two men arguing over grain. One believes the other has taken more than his share. Maybe he is right, maybe he is wrong. But the argument happens in public. Other people are watching. Pride gets involved. Voices rise. Hands tighten. At that moment, rage offers something seductive. It tells you that hurting the other person will restore your dignity, that making them afraid will prove your strength, that revenge will set the world right. But it does not. It creates more disorder. One act of fury brings retaliation. Retaliation pulls in relatives. Relatives bring old resentments. Soon, a dispute over grain becomes a feud that damages an entire community. And for the Egyptians, that was the opposite of Ma'at. Ma'at was balance, truth, justice, the proper order of things. Rage was dangerous because it could make a person act without balance, without truth, without any concern for consequences. It could turn strength into cruelty and authority into abuse. A powerful official in a rage could punish an innocent worker. A husband in a rage could shatter his own household. A merchant in a rage could cheat a customer, then justify it as payback. The emotion passes, the damage remains. Now, we should be careful here. Spell 125, the chapter containing the negative confessions, is not a modern psychology manual. It is not saying Egyptians believed nobody should ever feel anger. And these declarations of innocence are not proof that later biblical ethics were copied from Egypt. But they do show something important. Long before the Sinai story was written down in its final form, Egyptian religious thought could treat uncontrolled rage as a threat to moral order. Not because anger feels unpleasant, because anger once unleashed against other people can become chaos with a human face. And rage rarely stops with the person who first feels it. It spreads. It makes others fearful. It makes them defensive. It makes them weep. Which brings us to the next confession, one that may be quieter than violence, but no less revealing. 26. I have not made anyone weep. I have not made anyone weep. This one lands differently. I have not murdered. I have not stolen. I have not terrorized anyone. Those are obvious acts. You can point to them. You can name the victim. You can see the consequences. But making someone weep, that reaches into a more personal kind of harm, because tears can come from violence, but they can also come from humiliation, from betrayal, from hunger, from being cheated by someone you trusted, from watching an official take what your family needs to survive, from being spoken to as if you are worthless. The declaration does not simply ask whether the deceased committed some dramatic crime. It asks whether their actions caused sorrow in another human being. And that is a remarkable moral question. Imagine a widow after her husband has died. Maybe she has little land. Maybe she depends on grain rations or the fairness of relatives. A corrupt official sees an opportunity. He takes part of what she is owed. He can tell himself it is only a few measures of grain. He can say she will manage somehow, but he does not see the evening that follows. He does not see her trying to divide too little food among children. He does not see her fear as the storage jar empties. He does not see the tears, or perhaps he does see them, and does not care. That is the moral failure this confession exposes. The Egyptians understood that suffering was not always caused by a weapon. Sometimes it was caused by indifference. Sometimes it came from a person who had the power to help but chose instead to take advantage. Sometimes sorrow was created by a cruel word delivered at exactly the wrong moment. I have not made anyone weep does not mean a person could live without ever disappointing anyone. That would be impossible, families argue. Business deals fail. People die, the world itself brings grief. But in the ritual setting of spell 125, the deceased is declaring that they did not knowingly inflict misery as a way of living. They did not make another person's pain the price of their own comfort. They did not treat tears as irrelevant. And again, this is not a list of laws in the modern sense. The negative confessions were declarations of innocence, spoken before divine judges during the judgment of the dead. Different translations give slightly different wording, and scholars still debate details of context and meaning. But the ethical force is hard to miss. A life was not judged only by what you took. It could also be judged by what your actions did to another person's heart. Did you leave people poorer, frightened, humiliated, grieving? Did your advantage become their suffering? Because Mart was not merely about keeping cosmic order in the abstract. It was about whether human beings could live together without turning every difference in power into an opportunity for cruelty. And once you begin asking whether you made someone weep, another question follows almost immediately. What did you do with the truth when it was in your hands? 27. I have not committed sexual wrong. I have not committed sexual wrong after the confession about making another person weep. This declaration takes us into one of the most personal and difficult areas of human life. Sex, desire, trust, the promises people make to one another when nobody else is supposed to be watching. Some translations of the negative confessions preserve a broad declaration here. Not one narrowly defined offence, not one exact situation. A larger claim. I have not committed sexual wrong, and that broadness matters, because sexual wrongdoing is not only about desire. Desire is part of being human. The Egyptians knew that. Their myths, love poetry, family life, and images of fertility make that very clear. They were not pretending that people lived without longing, attraction, jealousy, or temptation. The question was what a person did with those feelings. Did they use desire as an excuse to betray trust? Did they use power to take what was not freely given? Did they enter another household and leave damage behind them? Imagine a man with status. Maybe he is an official. Maybe he controls grain, labor assignments, access to land, the decisions that can make a family secure or desperate. A woman in a vulnerable position cannot easily say no to someone like that. Not if refusal might cost her food. Not if it might bring punishment to her husband or children. That is not simply a private encounter. That is power entering the bedroom. And power, used without restraint, creates disorder. It creates fear. It creates resentment. It creates broken families and hidden injuries that can spread outward through an entire community. For the Egyptians, this was not just a matter of personal embarrassment. It touched Marat itself. The balance that held society together depended on people recognizing boundaries. A household had to be protected. Trust had to mean something. The strong could not be allowed to turn every vulnerable person into an opportunity. But we need to be precise. Spell 125 is not a criminal code. These are declarations of innocence spoken by the deceased before divine judges. They are not a list of 42 laws in the modern legal sense, and they do not prove that Moses or the biblical commandments were directly borrowed from Egypt. What they show is something older and more complicated. Ancient Egyptian religion had developed a moral language for sexual conduct, betrayal, and restraint long before the final form of the Sinai story. The dead person does not stand before the gods and say, "I was perfect." They say, "I did not bring this kind of disorder into the world," and that is a serious claim. Because private choices are never entirely private when they leave someone frightened, dishonored, abandoned, or unable to trust again. But then comes an even more difficult question. What exactly counted as crossing the line? 28. I have not violated sexual boundaries. I have not violated sexual boundaries. Or perhaps, depending on the translation, something closer to, I have not committed sexual impurity. I have not had illicit relations. I have not defiled myself. This is where the familiar modern labels can become dangerous. It is tempting to read an ancient Egyptian declaration and immediately assign it a modern category. adultery, abuse, incest, assault, prostitution, sexual morality. But ancient texts do not always fit neatly into modern boxes. The Egyptian words behind these translations can carry meanings that scholars still debate. The exact offence may shift depending on the manuscript, the translation, and the ritual context. One version may sound broad, another may sound more specific, and a phrase that seems obvious in English may have carried social or religious meanings that are harder to recover after more than 3,000 years. So caution matters. We should not pretend we have a perfect ancient Egyptian rulebook sitting in front of us. But uncertainty does not mean the declaration says nothing. It tells us that sexual conduct could be treated as a matter of moral accountability before the gods. It tells us that certain boundaries were not merely social preferences. They were connected to purity, order, family, status, and the well-being of the community. Think about how fragile a household could be in ancient Egypt. A household was not just a place where people slept. It was an economic unit. Food was stored there. Children were raised there. Work was organized there. Inheritance passed through it. A marriage connected families, property, obligations, and survival. So when someone violated a sexual boundary, the consequences could reach far beyond two individuals. A spouse could be disgraced. Children could lose security. Families could turn against each other. A powerful person could exploit someone with no safe way to refuse. And then there was the religious dimension. Egyptian culture often linked purity and impurity to ritual life. A person approaching sacred space, participating in ceremonies, or claiming innocence before divine judges was not simply saying, "Nobody caught me." They were claiming they had not polluted the order they depended on. That is what makes these negative confessions so fascinating. They move constantly between the visible and the invisible, between what a court might punish and what only the gods, the victim, and the accused person might know. You can hide many things from your neighbours. You can hide them from your family. You can even hide them from yourself for a while. But in the Hall of Two Truths, according to the Egyptian imagination, there was nowhere left to hide. And if you want to go deeper into the kinds of mysteries ancient texts still leave behind, the channel's book on 12 unexplained mysteries is available through the website, link in the description. For now, the key point is simple. These declarations are not evidence of a single universal sexual code shared unchanged across Egypt and Israel. They are not proof of direct borrowing at Sinai, but they are evidence that Egyptians, centuries before the biblical tradition took its final written shape, could imagine the dead being judged for how they handled desire, trust, power, and the boundaries of other people. And boundaries matter because once they are ignored, something else usually follows. Not love, not freedom, harm. 29. I have not eaten my heart. I have not eaten my heart. At first that sounds almost impossible to understand. What does it mean to eat your own heart? The ancient Egyptians were not talking about a literal act. This is an idiom, a compressed image from a world where the heart was far more than an organ inside the body. The heart was memory, judgment, intention, character. It was the part of you that would be weighed after death against the feather of mat. So when the deceased declares, "I have not eaten my heart," they may be denying something inward, a kind of emotional self-destruction, grief that curdles into bitterness, anger that is fed and fed until it consumes the person carrying it, perhaps corrosive remorse, perhaps malice, perhaps the habit of turning pain over and over in the mind until it becomes part of your identity. The exact meaning is debated, as it often is with phrases this ancient. Different translations can give it slightly different shades, but the image itself is powerful. You know what it feels like. Someone insults you, someone betrays you, someone gets away with something you know was wrong. And for days, maybe years, you replay it. You feed the anger. You rehearse the revenge. You let the injury become the center of your inner world. Nobody else may see it. You still go to work. You still greet your neighbors. You still sit with your family. But inside, something is being consumed. Your own heart. For the Egyptians, morality was not only about dramatic public crimes, murder, theft, betrayal, false testimony. It also reached into the hidden world of thought and feeling. Not because they expected people never to mourn or never to become angry. That would be impossible. Ancient Egypt knew grief. They knew loss. Their tombs, laments, and prayers make that painfully clear. They lived with disease, childbirth deaths, accidents on the Nile, failed harvests, political chaos, and the constant knowledge that life could end suddenly. Grief was human. Anger was human. But allowing those things to consume your moral center was something else. Think of Ma'at as balance, truth, right relationship, the order that keeps the world from collapsing into chaos. A person who is eaten alive by resentment can bring chaos into every relationship they touch. They become suspicious, cruel, ready to wound someone else because they have already been wounded. And that is why this strange little declaration belongs among the negative confessions. The dead person is not simply claiming, "I did not hurt anyone with my hands." They are claiming, "I did not allow darkness to hollow me out from within." That is a much harder confession, because other people can see your actions. Only you know what you have been feeding in your heart. And once bitterness has been allowed to grow there, it does not always stay hidden. Eventually it reaches the hands. 30. I have not attacked anyone. I have not attacked anyone. After the inward danger of a heart consumed by grief or malice, the confession turns outward, to violence. Not murder, not yet. Something that may seem smaller. An attack, an assault, a blow, the deliberate use of physical force against another person. And that distinction matters, because ancient moral systems did not only recognize the most extreme crime, they could also recognize the violence that happens below the level of killing, the punch thrown in anger, the beating used to humiliate someone, the stronger person cornering the weaker one, the official who uses force because he can, the neighbor who turns an argument into an injury. A person does not have to die for violence to damage the order of the world. Imagine a crowded street in an Egyptian town, laborers carrying supplies, merchants arguing over payment, children moving between homes. A dispute begins over grain, debt, land, or an insult. One man has more status, more friends, more physical strength. He could settle it with words. He could bring witnesses. He could appeal to an official. Instead, he strikes. Maybe nobody dies. Maybe there is no great trial. Maybe the victim goes home bruised, embarrassed, and unable to work for days. But something has changed. Fear has entered the neighborhood. A grievance has been created. Families may now take sides. Retaliation becomes possible. One act of lesser violence can spread outward far beyond the moment it happened. That is the logic behind this declaration. The deceased stands before the divine judges and says, "I did not use my body, my strength, or my position to attack another person." And notice what this reveals about the negative confessions. They are not merely a list of spectacular sins designed for kings, criminals, and villains. They are concerned with ordinary human conduct, how you treated the person in front of you. Whether you made them afraid, whether you used force when restraint was possible. Of course, we should not turn Spell 125 into a modern criminal statute. It is a funerary text, a ritual declaration of innocence, and its wording survives in manuscripts from different periods. We cannot reconstruct every legal category from one line. But the moral principle is unmistakable. Killing was not the only wrong that needed answering for. Violence itself required denial. That may sound obvious now. But it is not always obvious in the real world. Societies often condemn murder while excusing the cruelty that comes before it. They call it discipline, honour, temper, a private matter, a necessary show of strength. The Egyptian dead could not rely on those excuses in the Hall of Two Truths. There, the question was simpler. Did you attack someone? Did you make the weak pay for your anger? Did you turn conflict into harm because you had the power to do it? And if violence could begin with one blow, then the next declaration moves toward another kind of destruction. Not what you do to a body, what you do with your words. 31. I have not been a violent person. I have not been a violent person. After denying a specific attack, the speaker goes further. This is no longer just about one blow, one fight, one terrible moment when anger got out of control. It is about character. Who were you when people knew you? Were you the person others avoided because your temper could turn without warning? Were you the person who settled every insult with threats, every disagreement with intimidation, every feeling of weakness with a display of force? Because there is a difference between committing violence once and becoming someone whose whole presence brings violence into the room. Ancient Egyptian society understood hierarchy. It understood power. There were officials, overseers, soldiers, landowners, labourers, servants, and people with almost no protection at all. In a world like that, strength could be dangerous. The person with authority could turn discipline into cruelty. The person with wealth could hire others to do harm. The person with physical power could make fear do the work that justice should have done. And fear spreads fast. Picture a household where one person is known for rage. Nobody knows what will set them off. A misplaced tool, a late payment, a careless word, a child making noise, a worker making a mistake. So everyone begins adjusting themselves around that person. They speak quietly. They hide the truth. They accept unfair treatment because challenging it feels too dangerous. No court may ever hear the case. No body may ever be found. But violence has already shaped the lives of everyone nearby. That is what makes this declaration so revealing. The deceased is not merely saying, I was never involved in a fight. They are saying, I did not become a source of terror. I did not make violence part of my identity. And that reaches deeper than it first appears. Anybody can claim that an individual act was justified. He insulted me. She provoked me. They owed me. I was defending my honour. I had a bad day, but patterns are harder to hide. If violence follows you from house to street, from argument to argument, from one relationship to the next, then eventually it is no longer an accident. It is who you have chosen to be. For the Egyptians, this mattered because Ma'at was not maintained only by courts and punishments. It depended on people exercising restraint before disorder could spread. A violent person does not just injure bodies, they damage trust. They teach children that power means cruelty. They turn neighbours into enemies. They invite retaliation, revenge, and chaos. And in the Hall of Two Truths, excuses would have had little weight. The heart was there. The record was there. The gods were listening. I have not been a violent person. Not perfect. Not never angry. Not never afraid. But not ruled by the urge to dominate, humiliate, or harm. And once the confession moves beyond violence between people, it enters an even more sacred space. The place where human beings came to stand before the divine. 32. I have not disturbed worship, I have not disturbed worship. To modern ears, that might sound like a small offence. Someone talks during a prayer, someone interrupts a ceremony. Someone causes a distraction in a holy place. But in ancient Egypt, worship was not just a private experience between one person and a god. It was part of how the universe stayed in order. The temples of Egypt were not simply gathering places. They were centers of ritual power. Every day, priests washed, clothed, fed, and honored the images of the gods. Incense was burned, words were spoken with precision, offerings were made. Sacred spaces were protected from impurity and disorder. These rituals were believed to help sustain Maat itself, the rising of the sun, the flooding of the Nile, the fertility of the fields, the stability of the kingdom, not in the mechanical sense that one missed prayer would immediately stop the river or darken the sky, but in the Egyptian imagination, the human world and the divine world were connected. Ritual mattered because order mattered, so to deliberately disturb worship was not merely rude. It was an intrusion of chaos into a place built to resist chaos. Imagine entering a temple while a ceremony is underway. The air is heavy with incense. Priests are performing actions learned through generations. Offerings have been prepared. The god is being honored according to rules older than anyone present. And then someone interrupts. Maybe they mock the ritual. Maybe they shout. Maybe they start a quarrel. Maybe they bring conflict into a place where conflict is supposed to be set aside. The disruption is not just noise. It breaks the concentration of the moment. It insults those who came in reverence. It treats what others consider sacred as if it were nothing. That is why this declaration belongs among the negative confessions of Spell 125. The dead person says, in effect, I did not violate the sacred devotion of others. I did not turn worship into disorder. Now, we should be careful here. This is not a modern statement about religious freedom in exactly the way we would use that phrase today. Ancient Egypt had its own religious system, its own temples, its own ideas about purity, authority, and proper ritual. Spell 125 is not a modern legal code, and the 42 declarations are not evidence that Moses copied them directly, but the moral concern is still unmistakable. There are moments when people come together to seek something beyond themselves, to mourn, to give thanks, to ask for protection, to honor the dead, to stand before what they believe is holy. To deliberately disrupt that is to place your own contempt above their devotion. And maybe that is the deeper principle. You do not have to share another person's beliefs to understand that reverence deserves restraint. You do not have to agree with every ritual to know that cruelty has no place in it, because once you begin mocking what others hold sacred, once you turn their prayer into an opportunity for humiliation, you are not defending order. You are feeding chaos, and the Egyptian dead, standing before the scales, had to deny even that. 33. I have not been a chatterer. I have not been a chatterer. At first, that sounds almost harmless. Not a murderer, not a thief, not a violent person, not someone who disrupted worship, but a chatterer. Why would careless talk matter enough to bring before the gods? Because speech is never just speech. A word can carry a warning across a village. It can seal an agreement. It can comfort someone in grief. It can teach a child what the world is supposed to be. But it can also do the opposite. It can spread a lie before anyone has a chance to defend themselves. It can turn suspicion into certainty. It can take a private mistake and make it public entertainment. And once words are loose, they are almost impossible to call back. Think about how conflict begins. Sometimes it begins with hunger, money, land, power. But sometimes it begins with one person talking. He said this about you. She was seen with him. They are planning something. You cannot trust them. Nobody knows whether it is true. Maybe the speaker does not even care. Maybe they just enjoy being the person with information, the person everyone gathers around, the person who can make a room suddenly go quiet. But the damage is real. One rumor can break a friendship that lasted for decades. One accusation can put a servant under suspicion. One careless comment can move through a household, a marketplace, an entire community, changing how people look at each other. That is why uncontrolled speech was morally dangerous. The Egyptian speaker in Spell 125 is not simply claiming, "I never talk too much." They are saying, "I did not use my voice to create disorder. I did not turn words into weapons. I did not make conflict for the pleasure of watching it spread." And this is where the declaration becomes uncomfortable, because almost everyone knows the temptation. You hear something shocking. You know a secret. You have an unflattering story about someone who hurt you. And there is that moment when you can either let it end with you or pass it along. Maybe you tell yourself you are only repeating what you heard. Maybe you say you are warning people. Maybe you insist it is probably true. But the question in the Hall of Two Truths would be much simpler. What did your words do? Did they bring clarity? Did they protect someone from harm? Or did they feed anger, envy, fear, and confusion? For the Egyptians, Matt depended on truth being spoken carefully. Not silence at all costs, not pretending evil had not happened. A false witness, a corrupt official, a dangerous person, all of these had to be confronted. But there is a difference between speaking truth and scattering poison. One restores order, the other makes chaos travel faster. And if you enjoy this kind of ancient mystery, our channel's book on the 12 Unexplained Mysteries is available through the website link in the description. Because the deeper you go into the ancient world, the more you realize that its greatest mysteries are not always hidden in tombs or temples. Sometimes they are hidden in a sentence like this: "I have not been a chatterer," a confession about the power of the tongue. Because even after death, the Egyptian heart could not claim innocence if its owner had spent a lifetime making other people's lives less peaceful with words. And after examining how a person spoke to equals, the confession now turns toward something even harder to ignore. How did they treat those beneath their power? 34. I have not wronged a servant. I have not wronged a servant. This is one of those declarations that forces us to look past the grandeur of ancient Egypt, past the pyramids, past the gold masks, past the painted tombs and towering temples. Because behind every great household, every estate, every official, there were people doing the work, preparing food, carrying water, cleaning rooms, tending animals, caring for children, working fields, running errands, serving those who had more status, more wealth, and more power. And that imbalance of power created a moral test. How do you treat someone who cannot easily answer back? Someone who depends on you for food, shelter, wages, or protection. Someone whose complaint may never be heard because your word carries more weight than theirs. The deceased stands before the divine judges and says, "I have not wronged a servant," not, "My servants never made mistakes," not, "I was always obeyed," not, "I had the right to do whatever I wanted in my own household." Instead, the declaration recognizes a boundary. Power did not erase responsibility. Now, we should not turn ancient Egypt into something it was not. It was deeply hierarchical. Servitude existed. Households were unequal. The social world of pharaohs, officials, laborers, and dependents was not based on modern ideas of equal rights. And the negative confessions of Spell 125 were not a modern legal code. But that is exactly what makes this line so striking. Within a society built on rank, the treatment of a dependent person could still be placed under divine scrutiny. The master was not morally invisible, The household was not beyond judgment. Imagine the possibilities. A servant breaks a cup. A worker arrives late. Food goes missing. A child is blamed for something they did not do. The powerful person has choices. They can investigate fairly. They can show restraint. They can recognize that accidents happen. Or they can humiliate, beat, withhold food, make a false accusation. Use a small mistake as an excuse to remind everyone who is in control. That kind of wrongdoing might never reach a court. The servant may have no family nearby, no money, no influence, no way to challenge the person who rules the household. But according to this declaration, the gods saw it. The heart remembered it, and in the hall of two truths, status could not make cruelty disappear. That is the force of these words. I have not wronged a servant. It means justice was not supposed to stop at the door of the wealthy. It means the weak were not morally insignificant. It means how you behaved in private when nobody powerful was watching could still decide the fate of your soul. And maybe that is the question buried inside the confession. Not how did you treat people who could reward you? How did you treat people who could do nothing for you? The people who depended on your fairness, the people who feared your anger, the people whose voices were easiest to ignore because cruelty toward the powerless is one of the oldest forms of chaos. And the Egyptians believed chaos always leaves a mark on the heart. 35. I have not caused pain. I have not caused pain. After the confession about wronging a servant, this one widens the circle, because pain is not limited to one kind of victim. It is not limited to murder. It is not limited to a beating witnessed in public. It can be inflicted by a ruler on a worker, a parent on a child, a neighbour on someone weaker, a creditor on a family already drowning in debt, and it can be inflicted without leaving a visible wound. The declarations of innocence in spell 125 do not give us a modern legal code. They are not courtroom statutes carved into stone. They are words the deceased hoped to speak before the divine judges, proving that their heart had not become a source of chaos. And pain was chaos. Think about what it means to cause suffering when you have the power to avoid it. You can punish someone far beyond what they deserve. You can exploit their fear. You can force them to work until their body gives out. You can watch someone struggle and decide that their misery is none of your concern. Or worse, you can enjoy it. That may be the darkest possibility behind this declaration. Not just that suffering happened, but that someone with power looked at another human being in pain and felt nothing. Ancient Egypt was not a gentle world. Life depended on the Nile's rhythms, on harvests, on labour, on obedience to officials, on surviving disease and injury without anything like modern medicine. A broken limb, an infected wound, a failed crop. Any one of these could transform a life, which meant people understood pain very well. They saw it in the fields. They saw it among labourers. They saw it in childbirth, illness, old age, and famine. So when the deceased says, I have not caused pain, the statement is not sentimental. It is serious. It is a claim about the kind of person they were when another person was vulnerable. Did they make suffering worse? Did they use force when restraint was possible? Did they turn authority into cruelty? The Egyptians believed the universe depended on Ma'at, the fragile balance of truth, justice, right measure, and order, causing needless pain pushed against all of it. It made the world less stable. It made fear spread. It trained the weak to expect cruelty and the powerful to believe they could escape consequences. But in the Hall of Two Truths, consequences had finally arrived. There a person could not point to their title. They could not hide behind wealth. They could not say everyone else behaved the same way. Their heart was weighed, and every act that had made another person suffer could become part of that weight. That is why this declaration reaches far beyond obvious violence. I have not caused pain. It asks whether your strength protected people or frightened them, whether your power relieved suffering or created it. And once pain enters a community, hunger is never far behind, because one of the easiest ways to hurt another person is not to strike them. It is to deny them the food that keeps them alive. 36. I have not caused hunger, I have not caused hunger. For an agricultural civilization built around one great river, these words carried enormous weight. Egypt depended on the Nile. Its yearly flood brought water and fertile black silt to the fields. Farmers planted grain, granaries filled, bread was baked. Beer was brewed, taxes were collected, workers were fed. When that system worked, Egypt could sustain cities, temples, armies, and immense building projects. But when it failed, the consequences could be terrifying. A weak inundation could mean poor harvests. Poor harvests could mean empty storage jars. Empty storage jars could mean rising prices, debt, desperation, sickness, and death. Hunger was not an abstract problem. It was a threat that could enter a household slowly. First, people ate less, then they sold possessions. Then they borrowed grain, then they became dependent on someone who had food to spare. And that is where morality became a test. Imagine you own a full granary while your neighbours have almost nothing. You have grain stored behind sealed doors. You have servants guarding it. Families nearby are cutting their portions smaller each day, trying to make one basket last another week. What do? Do you share? Do you sell at a fair price? Do you provide food to workers and dependents? Or do you see scarcity as an opportunity? Do you hoard what others need? Do you withhold rations to punish someone? Do you demand impossible repayment from a hungry family? The declaration does not say, I made sure everyone in Egypt was fed. No individual could make that promise. But it does say, I have not caused hunger. That matters, because hunger can be caused. Not only by drought, not only by failed crops, but by greed, neglect, corruption, and the decision to keep food from those who depend on you. A household head could cause hunger. An official collecting grain could cause hunger. A powerful landowner could cause hunger. Someone responsible for workers could cause hunger simply by taking their rations, delaying payment, or deciding that the weak could wait. And in a society where bread was life, withholding food was more than selfishness. It was an attack on life itself. This is another moment when we should be careful. Spell 125's negative confessions are declarations of innocence from Egyptian religious tradition. They are not proof that every Egyptian lived by these ideals. They are not evidence that later biblical laws were directly borrowed from them. But they show something remarkable. More than 1,000 years before the traditional setting of Moses at Sinai, Egyptians could imagine a soul being judged for whether it had helped create hunger in the world. That is not a small moral concern. It means the fate of the poor, the worker, the dependent, and the hungry person mattered before the gods. And maybe the confession asks an even sharper question. When you had enough, what did you do with it? Did your abundance become protection for others, or did it become a weapon? Because a hungry person does not need a lecture about order. They need bread. And in the Hall of Two Truths, the heart had to answer for every time it could have given that bread, but chose not to. 37. I have not shut my ears to truth. I have not shut my ears to truth. After hunger, this may sound almost less urgent. No grain is being withheld. No body is being struck. No one is visibly suffering. But think about what happens when a person refuses to hear what is true. A worker comes forward and says the rations are missing. A widow says an official has taken what belongs to her. A farmer says the tax collector measured his grain unfairly. A servant says they have been beaten. A child says someone is afraid, and the person with power does not have to deny any of it. They can do something easier. They can simply refuse to listen. Some translations and versions of these Egyptian declarations condemn the refusal to hear truthful speech. The wording varies across the surviving texts, as ancient religious texts often do. But the moral idea is clear enough. Truth is not only something you must speak, it is something you must be willing to receive, because truth can be inconvenient. It can accuse you, it can expose a friend, a relative, a superior, or even yourself. It can demand that you change a decision already made. And for someone in authority, shutting your ears to truth can be one of the most dangerous acts of all. Not because it looks dramatic, but because it allows every other injustice to continue. A dishonest official survives when nobody listens to complaints. A cruel master survives when witnesses are ignored. A corrupt system survives when the people inside it decide they would rather have peace than the truth. And ancient Egypt understood that truth was bigger than personal honesty. The Egyptian word mat could mean truth, but also justice, balance, right order, the way the world was supposed to function. To reject truth was not just to make a mistake in conversation. It was to push against the order that held society together. Imagine standing in the hall of two truths. Your heart is on the scales. You have declared that you did not steal, did not kill, did not cause pain, did not cause hunger. But then the judges ask another question. When the truth came to you, did you listen? When someone weaker spoke, did you hear them? When you learned that harm was being done, did you turn away because knowing would make you responsible? That is where this confession becomes uncomfortable. Most people do not shut their ears to truth because they cannot understand it. They shut their ears because understanding it would cost them something. It might cost money, status, comfort, loyalty to the wrong person. It might force an apology. It might force action, and action is harder than ignorance. This is why the negative confessions of Spell 125 are more than a list of obvious crimes. They reach into the private decisions that make injustice possible. The moments when someone speaks, and you decide their voice does not matter. I have not shut my ears to truth. It is a declaration of innocence. But it is also a challenge, not just, did you tell the truth? Did you make room for it when it came from someone else? Because a society can survive an honest mistake. It cannot survive for long when powerful people become determined not to hear what is real. And if refusing truth damages Ma'at, then speaking against the divine order itself was even more dangerous. 38. I have not blasphemed, I have not blasphemed. To a modern listener, that may sound like a rule about forbidden words. Do not insult the gods. Do not speak irreverently. Do not say something offensive in a sacred place. And yes, language mattered in ancient Egypt. Names had power. Ritual words had power. The gods were not distant ideas. They were woven into the Nile, the sun, the harvest, kingship, death, birth, and the hope that life could continue beyond the grave. But blasphemy was not only about saying something shocking. It was about defying the sacred order of the universe. The deceased standing before the divine judges was making a massive claim. I did not treat what is holy as worthless. I did not mock the powers that sustain life. I did not place myself above Ma'at. That last part matters. Because Ma'at was not just a religious symbol, it was the principle that held back chaos. Truth against lies. Justice against abuse. Balance against greed. Right measure against the arrogance of those who think they can do whatever they want. To blaspheme against that order was dangerous, because it could begin with words, but it did not have to end there. a person could praise the gods publicly while living dishonestly. They could enter a temple, offer incense, speak the correct prayers, then go outside and cheat a worker, exploit the hungry, or ignore the truth. In that sense, blasphemy was not simply an insult spoken aloud. It could be hypocrisy. It could be pretending that sacred order mattered while helping chaos spread through the world. And that is why the Hall of Two Truths was such a terrifying idea. The gods were not impressed by performance alone. A person could know every ritual phrase and still fail. They could carry status, wealth, education, even religious authority, and still face the scales with a heart made heavy by what they had done. The declaration, "I have not blasphemed," becomes a claim that the deceased had not rejected the moral structure behind Egyptian religion. They had not treated truth as optional. They had not treated justice as something only weak people needed. They had not treated divine order as a tool for controlling others while escaping judgment themselves. Now, this is where comparisons with later traditions can become tempting. The concern for reverence, truth, and moral accountability may sound familiar to anyone who knows the commandments associated with Sinai. But similarity is not proof of direct borrowing. Spell 125's negative confessions belong to an Egyptian funerary world, shaped by Egyptian gods, Egyptian rituals, and the weighing of the heart. They are declarations the dead hoped would establish their righteousness before divine judges. Still, the question they ask is ancient, powerful, and unsettling. What happens when people lose reverence for anything beyond themselves? When truth becomes negotiable? When justice becomes a joke? When the powerful decide there is no higher standard, no cosmic balance, no final reckoning? That is the world Ma'at was meant to prevent, and for the Egyptian dead the final test was approaching. Not whether they had spoken beautifully, not whether they had looked pious, but whether their heart had truly honoured the order they claimed to believe in. Because once the words were spoken, there was nowhere left to hide. The heart itself would testify, 39. I have not stirred up strife. I have not stirred up strife. After the heart has been weighed against truth, after the dead have declared they did not reject what was sacred, another danger appears. Conflict. Not the kind that arrives from outside, like drought or invasion. The kind that begins with a sentence, a rumour, an accusation whispered into the right ear, a small insult repeated until it becomes a feud between families. Ancient Egyptian life depended on cooperation at a level most of us barely think about today. Fields had to be planted and harvested at the right time. Irrigation channels had to be maintained. Grain had to be measured, stored, and distributed. Temples, workshops, households, and villages all depended on people performing their roles without tearing each other apart. So when the deceased declared, "I have not stirred up strife," they were not merely claiming they had avoided arguments. They were saying, "I did not help chaos enter the community," and chaos was the enemy. Ma'at represented truth, justice, balance, and proper order. Its opposite was disorder, lies, violence, greed, the collapse of trust between people who had to live and work together. Think about how easily strife can be manufactured. One official tells a worker that his neighbour received more grain. One merchant spreads word that another merchant cheats his customers. One relative brings an old grievance into a new dispute. Nobody has to draw a weapon at first. They just have to make other people suspicious. Once trust begins to break, everything else follows. Neighbours stop helping neighbours. Families divide. Workers refuse cooperation. A village already struggling through a bad season becomes even more vulnerable because its people are too busy fighting each other. That is why this confession goes deeper than, "I was not rude." It asks whether you created division where peace was possible. Did you make enemies for your own advantage? Did you turn people against one another? Did you enjoy watching a dispute grow because it gave you influence? There is something almost modern about that question, because stirring up strife is often easy when you are not the one who will pay the price. You can spread a rumour, then stand back. You can provoke anger, then claim you were only repeating what you heard. You can turn a disagreement into a conflict and let everyone else suffer the consequences. The Egyptian dead could not hide behind that excuse in the Hall of Two Truths. Their heart knew why they had spoken. It knew whether they had sought justice or simply enjoyed disorder. And if ancient beliefs like this fascinate you, our book on 12 Unexplained Mysteries explores more of the strange questions history still refuses to answer. You can find it through the website link in the description. But this declaration was not asking the dead to be passive. Ancient Egypt was not telling people never to challenge wrongdoing. Truth sometimes creates conflict because injustice does not surrender quietly. The issue was not honest disagreement. It was the deliberate creation of division. The kind of conflict that serves ego, greed, revenge, or power. I have not stirred up strife. A simple sentence. But in a society built on mart, peace was not merely the absence of shouting. It was the presence of balance, and nothing destroys balance faster than people who turn one another into enemies. But conflict could destroy a community slowly. Taking food from someone could destroy it immediately. 40. I have not stolen bread. I have not stolen bread. At first, this may sound like theft again. And it is. But bread receives special attention because bread was not a luxury. It was survival. For ancient Egyptians, bread was one of the foundations of daily life. Grain came from the Nile's annual rhythm. Fields were planted, harvested, threshed, ground, kneaded, baked. A disruption at any point could mean hunger, a bad flood, a weak harvest, a dishonest measure, a corrupt official, and suddenly the food that should have sustained a household was gone. So when the deceased declared, "I have not stolen bread," they were not talking about taking a casual meal from someone who could easily replace it. They were saying, "I did not take another person's necessity." Imagine a labourer paid partly in grain, a widow with a small store of bread for her children, a farmer trying to make his harvest last until the next season, a poor household with no reserve, no wealth, no protection from one hungry week becoming a hungry month. To steal bread from them was not just to violate property. It was to turn your own hunger or your own greed into their suffering. That is why the statement is so stark. Not, "I have not stolen treasure," not, "I have not taken gold, bread." The most ordinary thing, the thing people need every day. And perhaps that is exactly why it mattered so much. Grand crimes are easy to condemn. Most people understand that murder, robbery, and betrayal are wrong. But daily injustice can hide in ordinary acts. Taking a little extra grain, keeping back a ration, altering a measurement, removing food from someone who lacks the status to complain. One loaf may not look like much to the person taking it. To the person who loses it, it may mean a child does not eat. This is the moral world behind the negative confessions of Spell 125. They were not a written civil code in the modern sense, and they do not prove that later commandments were copied from Egypt. They were declarations of innocence spoken by the dead within an Egyptian funerary ritual. But they reveal a society that understood something brutally practical. Justice is not abstract when people are hungry. Ma'at was not only about ceremonies, temples, and cosmic balance in the heavens. It was about fair measures in the marketplace, honest distribution of grain. The recognition that another person's basic need places a limit on what you are permitted to take. And there is another layer here. Bread theft can happen because someone is desperate. Ancient Egypt knew poverty, debt, labour exploitation, and famine. The confession does not explain every circumstance. It does not tell us how divine judges weighed need against greed, but it does insist that food mattered morally, that taking the necessities of life was serious, because a civilization can build pyramids, raise temples, and praise the gods. But if the powerful take bread from the weak, then Ma'at has already been broken. I have not stolen bread. The dead spoke those words before the scales, and somewhere behind them was a question no amount of ritual could avoid. When you had enough, did you leave enough for others to live? 41. I have not damaged cultivated land. I have not damaged cultivated land. After bread comes the land that made bread possible. For ancient Egypt, this was not just dirt, it was life. Every year the Nile flooded its banks and left behind a layer of dark, fertile silt. Out of that narrow strip of cultivated ground came grain, vegetables, flax, animal fodder, and the wealth that sustained villages, temples, officials, and the state itself. Beyond it waited the desert. So damaging farmland was not a small offence. It was an attack on the fragile system that kept people alive. Think about how limited good land could be. Egypt was a civilization stretched along a river, with most of its population dependent on fields close enough to receive the Nile's water. A plot of damaged soil could mean less grain. Less grain could mean fewer loaves. Fewer loaves could mean hunger, debt, desperation, and conflict. One person's carelessness could become another family's disaster. Maybe someone trampled a field to save time. Maybe they let animals destroy young crops. Maybe they moved boundary markers, claimed land that was not theirs, or neglected an irrigation channel until fertile ground dried out. The exact act is not always explained for us. The negative confessions are not a courtroom transcript. They are declarations of innocence from spell 125, spoken by the deceased as they faced judgment in the afterlife. But the principle is clear. I did not destroy what others needed to survive. That matters because cultivated land represented more than private property. It was part of Ma'at, the balance between nature, labour, community, and divine order. The Nile gave its flood. Farmers gave their work. Officials were supposed to organise resources fairly, and the land, if protected, gave life back to everyone. Break one part of that cycle, and the entire system begins to weaken. There is something deeply practical in this confession. Ancient Egyptian morality was not only concerned with spectacular sins, it looked at the things people depended on every day: bread, peace between neighbours, honest measures, and now the fields themselves. Because civilizations are not sustained by monuments. They are sustained by soil. The pyramids could rise above the horizon, but they could not feed a hungry village. The temples could store treasure, but no gold could replace a failed harvest. If cultivated land was damaged, then the agricultural order sustained by the Nile was threatened at its roots. I have not damaged cultivated land. Before the scales, the dead declared that they had not ruined the source of another person's future. But even fertile land was helpless without one thing. Water, 42, I have not blocked flowing water. I have not blocked flowing water. In some translations, this declaration appears as a condemnation of obstructing water. And in ancient Egypt, that could not have been more serious. Water was not simply useful. Water was survival moving through the landscape. The Nile was Egypt's great artery. Its flood renewed the soil. Its channels carried water toward fields. Its waters supported fishing, transport, washing, construction, and daily life. Villages and farms depended on access that could not be taken for granted, especially beyond the riverbank itself. So imagine what it meant to block that flow. A person upstream diverts water toward his own land. A landowner closes a channel. Someone obstructs a canal through neglect, greed, or revenge. The result may seem invisible at first. No dramatic crime. No shattered door. No stolen treasure. Just water failing to arrive. Then a field dries. A crop weakens. A household loses food. And a dispute that began with one blocked channel can spread through an entire community. That is why this confession is so powerful. It recognizes something that modern people understand all too well. Controlling access to water is controlling access to life. The person who blocks flowing water may not hold a weapon. They do not need one. They can harm others simply by denying them what nature was supposed to provide. For Egyptians, the Nile's rhythm was tied to the order of the universe. Its arrival brought renewal. Its absence brought fear. Low floods could lead to scarcity. Failed crops could bring famine. And because water was so essential, its fair movement through the agricultural world carried moral weight. I have not blocked flowing water. The declaration does not prove there was a modern environmental law book in ancient Egypt, and it does not establish that Moses borrowed commandments from Spell 125. These are the deceased person's ritual claims of innocence before divine judges, rooted in Egypt's own religious vision of Ma'at, but they reveal an ancient awareness that is impossible to miss. You cannot claim to uphold order while cutting others off from the essentials of life. Bread mattered, land mattered, and water mattered most of all. Because without water, bread does not grow. Without water, cultivated land becomes dust. Without water, cooperation turns into competition, and competition can turn into violence. The dead stood before the divine scales and claimed they had not interfered with that sacred flow. Not because water belonged only to them, but because life depended on letting it reach others. And that brings us to the end of the 42 declarations. I have not stolen. I have not killed. I have not spoken falsehood. I have not taken food from the hungry. I have not cheated with the scales. I have not damaged cultivated land. I have not blocked flowing water. Read them one after another, and the pattern becomes impossible to miss. This was a moral world concerned with violence, dishonesty, greed, abuse of power, hunger, land, and the basic conditions that allowed a community to survive. But we should be careful with the claim in this video's title. The negative confessions of Spell 125 are not the Ten Commandments. They were not a simple legal code carved into stone. They were ritual declarations of innocence, spoken by the dead before divine judges in the Egyptian afterlife, and their existence does not prove that Moses directly borrowed from Egypt. What they do prove is something just as fascinating. Long before the biblical story of Sinai was written down, ancient Egyptians were asking profound moral questions. What do you owe other people? What does justice look like when nobody is watching? Can a person claim innocence if they profited from another person's hunger, ruined their land, manipulated their measures, or cut off their water? Their answer was Ma'at, balance, truth, right order. And maybe that is why these words still feel so modern. Because beneath the names of Egyptian gods and the rituals of the tomb, the concerns are still ours. If you enjoyed this journey into one of history's oldest moral texts, kindly like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment. Which of the 42 declarations surprised you most? And once again, where in the world are you listening from? For more ancient mysteries, our book on 12 unexplained mysteries is available through the website link in the description. And the best way to support the channel is by listening on Spotify through the link below. Because the dead Egyptians believed every heart would be weighed. The question is, after thousands of years, what would your heart say?